what if the past is not as distant as we imagine? Not because ancient civilizations still exist, but because the questions they left behind continue to shape the present. Every year, new discoveries force historians to revise timelines, redraw maps, and rethink what early societies were capable of achieving. A forgotten settlement changes the story of an empire. A hidden chamber transforms the meaning of a famous monument. A single inscription challenges decades of accepted research. The ancient world is not a finished chapter locked in museums. It is an unfinished investigation, with every excavation adding new evidence instead of a final answer. Across deserts, mountains, islands, and forgotten valleys, countless ancient structures still stand, not simply as monuments to the past, but as reminders that humanity may know far less about its own origins than it once believed. At an altitude of over 5,000 meters in the remote reaches of the Himalayas, a small glacial lake appears unremarkable for most of the year. Frozen, isolated, and inaccessible, it blends into a landscape shaped by ice and silence. But when the snow melts, the surface reveals something that should not exist in such numbers or in such a place. Hundreds of human skeletons scattered along the edges of the water, preserved by cold and time. The problem is not simply that these people died here. The problem is that they did not die together, did not come from the same place, and yet appear to have met the same end. Rupkund Lake is not a single mystery. It is a pattern of events repeating across centuries without a clear explanation. The modern story begins in 1942, when a British forest ranger, patrolling the region during the late colonial period of India, came across a disturbing sight. As the ice receded, human bones began to emerge across the lake bed and surrounding slopes. Initial assumptions were shaped by the context of the time. With the Second World War underway, officials speculated that these might be the remains of Japanese soldiers who had attempted an incursion through the mountains. However, closer inspection quickly dismantled this theory. The skeletal remains showed clear signs of age far beyond a few decades. No modern weapons, uniforms, or equipment were found. Instead, artifacts such as wooden tools, leather footwear, iron spearheads, and rings suggested a much older origin. What began as a wartime curiosity immediately transformed into an archaeological anomaly. By the 1950s and 60s, systematic examinations of the bones began. Anthropologists noted that many of the skeletons were remarkably well preserved due to the freezing conditions, allowing for detailed study. One of the most striking findings was the pattern of injuries. A large proportion of skulls displayed circular fractures, consistent with blunt force trauma delivered from above. These were not random breaks caused by erosion or animal activity. The injuries were concentrated on the top of the skull, with minimal damage to other parts of the body. This distribution ruled out close combat or interpersonal violence. Instead, it suggested a sudden, external force acting vertically. Based on these observations, researchers proposed a hypothesis grounded in environmental physics. At high altitudes, hailstorms can produce ice projectiles with diameters exceeding 5 centimeters and impact velocities sufficient to fracture bone. If a group of individuals were caught in an exposed area without shelter, repeated impacts could cause fatal head injuries within minutes. This explanation aligned with both the injury patterns and the lack of defensive wounds. However, it did not explain who these people were, why they were there, or why so many died in the same location. In the early 2000s, advances in radiocarbon dating provided the first reliable timeline. Initial tests suggested that a significant portion of the remains dated to approximately the 9th century. This placed the event more than 1,000 years before the modern discovery. The implication was clear. These individuals were not linked to any recent historical conflict, but to a much older, undocumented event. The number of individuals estimated between 200 and 800 indicated that this was not a small group. It was a large, organized movement of people. Further analysis of clothing fragments and artifacts revealed diversity within the group. Some individuals wore simple, practical garments consistent with local populations. Others were associated with more elaborate items, including ornaments and decorated objects. This suggested a mixed group, possibly including both common travelers and individuals of higher social status. One hypothesis proposed that they were part of a pilgrimage, possibly connected to ancient Himalayan religious practices. Yet, no written records from the period clearly describe such a large group meeting this fate in this location. In 2019, a comprehensive genetic study introduced a new layer of complexity. Using ancient DNA sequencing, researchers analyzed dozens of individuals from the site. The results fundamentally altered the understanding of Rupkund. Instead of a single group, the remains belonged to at least two distinct populations separated not only by geography, but also by time. One group was consistent with South Asian ancestry and dated to around the 8th to 10th centuries. This aligned with earlier radiocarbon findings and supported the pilgrimage hypothesis. However, a second group displayed genetic markers most closely associated with populations from the Eastern Mediterranean, including regions such as Greece and Crete. Even more surprising was the dating of this group. They appeared to have died roughly 1,000 years after the first group. This created a contradiction that current historical models struggle to resolve. There is no clear evidence of large-scale Mediterranean travel into this specific region of the Himalayas during that period. Nor is there an explanation for why these individuals would have followed a path leading to such an isolated and hazardous location. The presence of two unrelated groups, separated by centuries, yet ending up in the same lake, suggests that Rupkund is not the result of a single historical event. When all evidence is considered together, a pattern begins to emerge. Multiple groups from different regions and different centuries arrived at the same high-altitude lake. Each group appears to have died suddenly, with similar trauma concentrated on the skull. There is no evidence of long-term habitation, no signs of burial practices, and no indication that survivors remained to document the event. The deaths were abrupt and final. From a scientific perspective, the most consistent explanation remains extreme weather, specifically high-energy hailstorms. At elevations above 5,000 meters, atmospheric conditions can produce localized events of extraordinary intensity. Without modern forecasting or protective equipment, ancient travelers would have had no warning and no means of escape. Yet, this explanation raises its own questions. Why did multiple groups choose this route? Why were they exposed at precisely the same vulnerable location? And why does the pattern repeat across such long intervals? Rupkund Lake challenges the assumption that archaeological sites represent isolated events. Instead, it suggests the possibility of recurring environmental hazards interacting with human movement in ways that are not fully documented. The combination of radiocarbon dating, forensic analysis, and genetic data creates a layered narrative that does not resolve into a single conclusion. Each new discovery has added clarity to individual aspects: how they died, when they died, and where they came from, but has also expanded the scope of the mystery. If a single natural mechanism can produce identical outcomes across centuries, then Rupkund may represent a broader class of sites where environmental risk is underestimated or misunderstood. Alternatively, if there are missing historical connections, trade routes, undocumented migrations, or lost cultural practices, then the lake may be a fragment of a much larger story that has not yet been reconstructed. If multiple groups, separated by centuries and coming from entirely different regions, all ended up dying in the exact same way at the same location, do you think Rupkund is just a natural hazard repeated over time, or are we missing a deeper pattern behind these events? Share your thoughts in the comments below. At first glance, this city should have been ordinary, yet everything about it feels unfinished, interrupted, and quietly unnatural. Just outside Bitola, the ruins of Heraclea Lyncestis lie along the ancient artery of Via Egnatia, a strategic route that once connected the Adriatic Sea to the eastern reaches of the Roman and Byzantine worlds. Founded in the 4th century BCE by Philip II of Macedon, the city should have evolved into a stable regional hub. Instead, its archaeological record tells a different story, one of repeated disruptions, unexplained abandonments, and a level of artistic and architectural precision that seems disproportionate to its status. Among all its mysteries, one stands out with unsettling clarity: the mosaics. They are not simply decorative. They are engineered surfaces that have survived more than 1,500 years with color stability and structural cohesion that still challenge modern assumptions about ancient materials. The site itself was never truly lost in the dramatic sense of forgotten cities swallowed by jungle or desert. Local awareness of the ruins persisted for centuries, but systematic archaeological investigation only began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scholars working in the region of Ottoman Macedonia started documenting classical remains near Bitola. Excavations intensified during the 20th century under Yugoslav and later North Macedonian authorities, revealing layers that span Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine occupation. What emerged was not a single coherent city, but a sequence of urban phases repeatedly damaged, partially rebuilt, and then, at least in some periods, abruptly abandoned. Unlike sites such as Pompeii, where a single catastrophic event explains the archaeological snapshot, Heraclea presents multiple discontinuities without a single definitive cause. The first layer of mystery lies in those interruptions. Stratigraphic evidence suggests that certain occupation phases ended suddenly. Domestic objects remain in situ. Construction projects appear halted mid-process. In typical urban decline, especially in the late Roman world, we expect gradual contraction, public buildings repurposed, infrastructure deteriorating slowly, population thinning over generations. Here, however, there are hints of more abrupt behavioral shifts. Some researchers have linked these breaks to known historical pressures: Gothic incursions in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, regional instability, or seismic activity in the Balkans. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the pattern. Earthquakes, for instance, leave distinctive collapse signatures, while invasions tend to produce burn layers, weapon remains, or mass destruction horizons. At Heraclea, the evidence is more ambiguous, suggesting disruption without a single, clearly identifiable trigger. But it is in the mosaics that the site becomes truly difficult to explain. The Byzantine basilicas of Heraclea contain floor mosaics that rank among the finest in the region, often compared to those of major centers such as Ravenna. At first glance, they follow familiar iconographic conventions, geometric patterns, vegetal motifs, and symbolic animals such as peacocks, which in early Christian art represent immortality. But a closer inspection reveals something more technical. The tesserae, the small pieces of stone, ceramic, or glass used to compose the images, are cut with remarkable uniformity, often measuring only a few millimeters across. Their placement is not merely aesthetic, it is structurally optimized. Angles, curvature, and spacing are adjusted to control how light interacts with the surface, producing a subtle but deliberate visual depth. What makes this particularly unusual is the durability of the color. After more than 1.5 millennia, many sections retain vivid contrasts, deep reds, saturated greens, and stable yellows, despite exposure to moisture, soil chemistry, and temperature fluctuations. Modern studies of ancient pigments show that many organic dyes degrade rapidly, while mineral pigments can remain stable but are often limited in chromatic range. Yet the palette at Heraclea suggests a more nuanced material selection. Some tesserae appear to incorporate iron-based oxides for reds and yellows, copper compounds for greens, and possibly imported stone types not native to the immediate region. This implies access to a broader material network than the city's size would suggest. When compared to Pompeii, where frescoes have also preserved strong coloration due to rapid burial under volcanic ash, the difference becomes significant. Pompeii's preservation is partly accidental, a product of an oxygen-poor environment that halted degradation. Heraclea's mosaics, by contrast, survived in open or semi-buried conditions. Their longevity is therefore not just a matter of circumstance, but of construction. The binding layers beneath the tesserae, composed of lime mortar, crushed ceramics, and carefully graded aggregates, form a multi-layered system that distributes stress and resists cracking. This technique is documented in Roman treatises such as those attributed to Vitruvius, yet the execution here appears unusually consistent and precise. The question is not whether ancient craftsmen were skilled; they undoubtedly were, but whether the level of optimization seen here exceeds what was functionally necessary. Floors needed to be durable and decorative, but not necessarily engineered to maintain chromatic integrity for over 15 centuries. That raises a deeper possibility that certain knowledge of material behavior, how pigments interact with binders, how microstructures resist environmental stress was more advanced, or at least more systematically applied, than surviving texts indicate. If so, then part of that knowledge may have been lost, fragmented across regions, or simply never recorded in detail. Beyond the mosaics, the architectural layout of Heraclea adds another layer to the puzzle. The basilicas exhibit strong axial symmetry, with nave and aisles proportioned according to ratios that align with broader Roman and Byzantine design principles. Columns are spaced with regular intervals, and the transition between public and liturgical spaces is carefully managed. This is not unusual in major urban centers such as Rome or Constantinople, but Heraclea was, by comparison, a provincial city. The presence of such refined planning raises questions about the transmission of architectural knowledge. Were standardized blueprints circulating across the empire? Were itinerant architects responsible for disseminating design principles? Or does this reflect a local tradition that has left few written traces? The theatre of Heraclea, too, reflects a level of technical competence that borders on the intuitive understanding of physics. Like the famous theatre at Epidaurus Theatre, it is capable of projecting sound from the stage to the upper seating tiers with minimal loss of clarity. Modern acoustic analysis of Greek theatres has shown that factors such as seat geometry, limestone absorption properties, and the curvature of the seating area all contribute to this effect. Yet ancient builders lacked formal acoustic theory in the modern sense. Their success suggests either a long process of empirical refinement or a practical knowledge system that has not been fully reconstructed. And then there is the question of disappearance, not of the ruins themselves, but of their historical voice. For a city positioned on Via Egnatia, one of the most important roads of the Roman world, Heraclea is surprisingly underrepresented in written sources. Major trade routes typically generate administrative records, inscriptions, and references in historical texts. While some inscriptions have been found at the site, they do not fully explain its role within the regional economy. This silence is not total, but it is disproportionate. It suggests that either the city's importance has been underestimated, or that parts of its historical record have been lost, destroyed, or never extensively produced. What do you think really happened here? And are these mosaics just art, or evidence of something we've already forgotten? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
Dol Harubong is not just a statue, it is a pattern, repeated across an island, carved into volcanic stone, and preserved through centuries without a clear origin story. Scattered across Jeju Island, these figures stand between 2 and 3 meters tall, their rounded hats and expressionless faces instantly recognizable. Official narratives place their creation in the 18th century under the Joseon dynasty, describing them simply as stone grandfathers meant to guard villages. But that explanation leaves too many gaps. There is no detailed record of who designed them, no documentation of how many were originally built, and no explanation for why their form is so consistent across different locations. For a culture that recorded rituals, laws, and architecture, the absence of precise documentation around Dol Harubong is the first anomaly, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. The first systematic attention to these statues did not come from ancient texts, but from modern observers. In the early 20th century, Japanese colonial surveys began cataloging cultural artifacts on Jeju, noting clusters of these figures near village gates and crossroads. Later, Korean archaeologists revisited these sites, measuring dimensions, mapping distribution, and analyzing material composition. What they found was not randomness. The statues were not placed arbitrarily. Many stood at transitional boundaries, between settlement and wilderness, between one administrative zone and another. Yet no unified map from the past has been recovered, meaning the system that once governed their placement has either been lost or was never formally recorded. Each new survey added data, height ranges averaging around 2 meters, weight estimates reaching several tons, and stylistic consistency across dozens of examples. But none answered the central question: why this exact form, repeated with such discipline? As excavation and preservation efforts expanded, researchers began focusing on variations. Subtle differences emerged: slight changes in facial proportions, minor deviations in hand placement, differences in the curvature of the hat. But these variations were narrow, almost as if they were produced within a constrained template. This raises a critical point. Dol Harubong may not be individual artistic expressions, but outputs of a standardized design logic. In modern manufacturing, repetition implies a system: measurements, guidelines, possibly even training methods passed between craftsmen. Yet no workshop remains have been definitively identified, and no tools have been found in direct association with the statues. Each archaeological phase has added detail, but also deepened the paradox. The more we measure, the more deliberate the system appears, and the less we understand its origin. At first glance, the statues seem crude. Their features are minimal, their surfaces uneven, their forms simplified. But this simplicity is deceptive. Dol Harubong are carved from basalt, a volcanic rock formed from rapidly cooled lava. Basalt is dense, hard, and structurally unpredictable. It fractures irregularly, making controlled shaping difficult without advanced tools. Even in modern stoneworking, basalt requires specialized equipment: diamond-tipped tools, controlled cutting techniques, and significant force to achieve smooth surfaces. Yet the statues of Jeju show a level of consistency that suggests control rather than improvisation. Their surfaces, while not polished, are intentionally shaped. The rounded hats are symmetrical. The eyes protrude in near-identical proportions. The hands rest on the abdomen in a standardized position that repeats across multiple statues separated by distance and, presumably, time. Creating a single 2-meter basalt statue with primitive tools would already require significant labor, potentially dozens or even hundreds of hours depending on technique. Replicating that process across dozens of statues, with consistent proportions, implies not just effort, but method. To understand the scale of this challenge, it is useful to compare Dol Haruyubong with other basalt-based constructions. On Easter Island, the Moai statues, some reaching over 10 meters, were carved from volcanic tuff, a softer material than basalt. Even then, the process required organized labor, quarry systems, and transport mechanisms that are still debated today. Basalt, by contrast, is significantly harder than tuff. If the Moai represent a large-scale effort with relatively workable stone, Dol Haruyubong represent a smaller scale but materially more resistant challenge. This shifts the mystery. Not how large the statues are, but how consistently they were produced from a more difficult medium. Experimental archaeology provides partial insight. When modern researchers attempt to shape basalt using reconstructed traditional tools, stone hammers, iron chisels of pre-industrial quality, they encounter rapid tool degradation and limited precision. Achieving smooth curvature, especially in repeated forms like the hats, becomes labor-intensive and inconsistent. Yet the statues of Jeju do not display extreme variation. This suggests either a level of craftsmanship higher than assumed, or the use of techniques that are not fully understood or documented. The absence of tool marks consistent with modern expectations adds another layer of uncertainty. Some surfaces appear worn, but whether this is due to weathering over centuries or original finishing techniques remains unclear. The commonly accepted explanation is that Dol Haruyubong served as protective figures, guardians placed at village entrances to ward off evil spirits. This interpretation aligns with broader East Asian traditions of gate guardians and symbolic protectors. However, the archaeological record offers little direct support. There are no associated altars, no inscriptions linking the statues to specific deities, and no consistent evidence of ritual activity around them. If they were central to spiritual practice, the material traces of that practice are surprisingly minimal. Alternative hypotheses have emerged. Some researchers suggest the statues functioned as territorial markers, defining boundaries in a landscape shaped by isolation and limited resources. Others propose a symbolic role tied to fertility, pointing to the statue's posture and form. Still others see them as social markers, representations of authority or communal identity. Each theory explains part of the pattern, but none fully accounts for the scale, consistency, and placement of the statues across the island. Mapping studies have revealed that many Dol Haruyubong align with points of entry, roads, paths, and coastal access routes. This suggests a functional logic tied to movement and control. Yet without historical maps or written records, the system remains incomplete. Were these statues part of a coordinated island-wide network? Or did each village independently adopt and replicate a shared design? The uniformity of form argues for connection. The lack of documentation argues for fragmentation. This tension defines the mystery. Dol Haruyubong exist in a space between intention and absence, clearly designed, clearly placed, yet lacking the contextual framework that would explain them. Every measurement, every survey, every comparison adds clarity to their physical reality while leaving their conceptual origin unresolved. What do you think these statues were really designed for, and why were they made so consistently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Carved into silent rock faces on the Trialeti Plateau, a collection of images exists that should not be this precise, this consistent, or this conceptually advanced for the time they are believed to belong to. They depict animals, hunters, abstract symbols, and radiant circles that resemble suns or stars. But beneath their simplicity lies something far more unsettling. These carvings do not behave like primitive art. They behave like a system. And systems imply intention, repetition, and knowledge. The deeper researchers look, the more a disturbing question begins to form. How does a society leave behind signs of structured thinking, possibly even astronomical awareness, without leaving behind the rest of the civilization that should logically accompany it? The petroglyphs of Trialeti were first systematically documented in the 20th century, although local awareness of the carvings likely stretches much further back. Located across scattered rock surfaces at elevations exceeding 1,500 meters, the site is not a centralized monument, but a dispersed network of engravings spread across the landscape as if intentionally integrated with the terrain itself. Initial surveys identified hundreds of carvings, later expanding into the thousands as more remote areas were explored. These included depictions of deer, horses, hunting scenes, and geometric figures. Early interpretations classified them as typical expressions of prehistoric life, likely dating between the Late Stone Age and Early Bronze Age, roughly between 4000 and 2000 BCE. However, as documentation improved, something unexpected emerged. The carvings were not random. Certain motifs, particularly circular symbols with radiating lines, clusters of dots, and repeated geometric arrangements, appeared again and again across different rocks and distances. This repetition suggested planning, not spontaneity. Subsequent archaeological efforts focused on cataloging patterns rather than individual images. Researchers began mapping symbol frequency, orientation, and grouping, uncovering statistical consistencies that hinted at something more structured than decorative or narrative art. As exploration extended into less accessible zones of the plateau, new carvings added layers of complexity. Some panels revealed overlapping generations of engravings, indicating that the site was used repeatedly over long periods, possibly centuries. Others showed compositions where animal figures coexisted with abstract symbols, as if two different conceptual systems were being expressed simultaneously. In several instances, the so-called sun symbols, circles surrounded by evenly spaced rays, displayed consistent counts. Some had 8 rays, others 12, and occasionally 16. These were not approximate. The spacing was deliberate, suggesting controlled division of a circle, a geometric operation that requires more than intuitive carving. Comparisons with other prehistoric sites intensified the mystery. At Lascaux Cave, dated to around 17,000 years ago, paintings show remarkable artistic skill but lack systematic geometric repetition. At Stonehenge, constructed around 3000 BCE, the alignment of stones clearly encodes solar events such as solstices, but that knowledge is embedded in large-scale architecture. Trialeti, by contrast, encodes possible cyclical patterns in minimal, portable carvings, without any supporting structural framework. This raises a critical contradiction. How can abstract patterning comparable in intent to monumental astronomy exist without monumental construction? The repeating motifs suggest a form of proto-symbolic communication. Yet unlike the writing systems of Sumerians or the inscriptions of Hittites, there is no evolutionary trail linking these symbols to later scripts. They appear fully formed, structured, and then disappear from the historical record. This absence of continuity is deeply problematic. In most cases, symbolic systems evolve, leaving transitional stages. Trialeti offers no such bridge. It is as if a language briefly existed and was then erased. The radial circles and patterned clusters strongly resemble representations of celestial cycles. The recurrence of specific ray counts, 8, 12, 16, aligns with natural periodic divisions, lunar phases, solar cycles, or seasonal segmentation. Yet there is no evidence that the creators possessed instruments capable of precise astronomical measurement. No observatories, no calibrated sightlines, no architectural alignments like those found at Stonehenge or later ancient observatories. This leads to a paradox. Either these communities possessed a level of observational discipline that left no physical trace, or the patterns are coincidental, though statistical repetition argues against coincidence. The most technically unsettling aspect of the Trialeti petroglyphs lies in how they were made. The method appears straightforward: pecking and incising using stone or early metal tools. No advanced technology, no complex machinery. And yet, the results contradict that simplicity. Across multiple carvings, line depth remains remarkably consistent. Variations that would normally arise from hand fatigue, tool degradation, or uneven force are minimal. This is not the occasional precise line. It is systemic consistency across different panels and locations. Circular shapes, in particular, approach geometric regularity. The distribution of radial lines is often evenly spaced, suggesting an implicit understanding of angular division. Achieving this by eye alone, repeatedly, across different artisans or generations, would be extraordinarily difficult. Modern experimental archaeology shows that even trained individuals using replica tools struggle to maintain such uniformity over extended carving sessions. Micro-variations in pressure typically produce irregular grooves, yet Trialeti carvings frequently avoid this. There is also the question of durability. Many engravings have survived thousands of years with clear visibility. This implies not only favorable environmental conditions, but also effective choices in carving depth, angle, and surface selection, factors that influence erosion rates. In short, the tools appear primitive, but the execution reflects a level of control that does not match expectations. The technique is simple in theory, but anomalously stable in practice. Unlike sites such as Göbekli Tepe, where monumental structures indicate organized labor and social complexity, Trialeti offers no equivalent framework. There are no large settlements, no architectural remains of similar sophistication, and no clear evidence of centralized authority or labor coordination. This disconnect is one of the most difficult aspects to reconcile. Complex symbolic behavior, potential astronomical encoding, and controlled craftsmanship typically emerge within structured societies. Here, they appear in isolation. It suggests one of two possibilities. Either the surrounding archaeological record is incomplete, or the assumptions about how complexity develops in human societies are themselves flawed. Scholars remain divided. Some argue that the carvings represent ritual or mythological symbolism, their apparent structure a projection of modern analytical frameworks. Others suggest that they encode environmental or seasonal knowledge critical for survival in a high-altitude landscape. More speculative theories propose that the site represents the remnants of a lost or transient cultural system, one that developed symbolic sophistication without leaving durable settlements. What remains consistent across all interpretations is uncertainty. The carvings resist definitive explanation, not because they are abstract, but because they are too structured to dismiss as random and too isolated to fit comfortably into known models of cultural development. What do you think these carvings really represent? Early science, lost knowledge, or something we still don't understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Afrasiab is the ancient core of Samarkand, a site whose buried layers reveal a level of technical sophistication that does not fully align with conventional timelines of urban development in Central Asia. What emerges from its ruins is not just a lost city, but a system, engineered with precision, maintained over centuries, and ultimately erased in a way that still raises unresolved questions. The discovery of Afrasiab was not a single breakthrough moment, but a gradual unveiling. By the late 19th century, Russian archaeologists began systematic excavations on the northeastern edge of modern Samarkand, uncovering walls, pottery, and urban remains buried beneath layers of earth. What initially appeared to be scattered ruins soon revealed a continuous settlement history, stretching back to approximately the 8th century BCE. Stratigraphic analysis showed multiple occupation layers, in some areas exceeding several meters in depth. Each layer represented a different phase of construction, destruction, and rebuilding, suggesting not just longevity, but continuity of technical knowledge. Unlike many ancient sites that show abrupt cultural breaks, Afrasiab appeared to evolve, refine, and adapt over time. Afrasiab existed in a semi-arid zone, where sustaining a large population required more than access to water, it required control. Excavations revealed an intricate network of canals, reservoirs, and distribution systems, many of which were aligned with subtle elevation gradients. Some channels maintained a consistent slope over long distances, minimizing stagnation and maximizing flow efficiency. Modern hydraulic engineering recognizes that even a gradient deviation of less than 1% can significantly alter water velocity and sediment buildup. The fact that ancient engineers achieved such consistency without modern instruments suggests either highly refined surveying techniques or long-term empirical calibration. Comparisons with other ancient hydraulic systems, such as those in Petra or the Karnat systems of Persia, show parallels in concept, but Afrasiab's integration into a dense urban grid appears unusually cohesive. This was not an add-on system, it was embedded into the city's design from the beginning. The layout of Afrasiab suggests more than organic growth. Defensive walls, administrative centers, residential clusters, and ceremonial spaces were arranged in a structured hierarchy. Roads connected directly to water distribution points, and population density appears to have been managed relative to resource access. Some alignments of streets and structures have been proposed to correspond with environmental factors such as prevailing winds or solar exposure. While these interpretations remain debated, the consistency of orientation across different construction phases indicates intentional planning. In comparison, many early urban centers, such as those in Mesopotamia, often show irregular expansion patterns, shaped by immediate needs rather than long-term planning. Afrasiab, by contrast, gives the impression of a city designed with foresight, as if its builders were working within a conceptual framework that has not been fully reconstructed. Among all discoveries, the Afrasiab murals stand as the most technically and conceptually unsettling. Dating to the 7th century CE, these wall paintings depict diplomatic scenes involving Sogdian rulers and foreign envoys from regions including China and Persia. At first glance, they appear to be historical artwork, but closer analysis reveals anomalies that challenge assumptions about ancient artistic capability. The pigments themselves are remarkably well preserved. After more than 13 centuries, many sections retain vivid blues, reds, and yellows, with minimal fading. Scientific analysis has identified mineral-based pigments such as lapis lazuli and iron oxides, but what remains unclear is the binding medium. The durability suggests the use of complex organic compounds or layered application techniques that enhanced adhesion and resistance to environmental degradation. In modern conservation science, Preserving color stability over centuries requires precise control over pigment composition, substrate preparation, and environmental conditions. Yet the Afrasiab murals achieved this without controlled environments. Compared to Roman frescoes, many of which have degraded significantly over similar timescales, the Afrasiab paintings display an unusual resilience. Even more striking is the execution. The lines are consistently fine, with minimal variation in thickness, suggesting controlled application tools. Facial proportions remain stable across multiple figures, implying either measurement guidelines or advanced artistic training systems. The perspective, while not fully geometric in the Renaissance sense, shows an understanding of spatial layering and narrative sequencing. Microscopic analysis reveals layered paint application, where base tones were applied first, followed by finer detailing. This multi-stage process requires not only technical skill, but also planning each layer must anticipate the next. Errors would be difficult to correct, yet the murals show little evidence of major revisions. The question is not whether ancient artists were skilled. They clearly were. But whether the level of precision seen here implies tools or techniques that have not been preserved. No detailed records of brushes, measurement instruments, or pigment preparation methods have been definitively linked to the murals. What remains is the result, artwork that behaves, in terms of durability and consistency, closer to engineered material than simple paint. In this sense, the Afrasiab murals blur the boundary between art and technology. They represent a system of knowledge, chemical, procedural, and aesthetic that appears fully developed yet largely undocumented. Afrasiab's fortifications evolved over time, becoming thicker and more complex in response to external threats. Some sections include angled bastions and layered walls designed to absorb and redirect impact forces. This suggests an understanding of mechanical stress and attack dynamics. Comparatively, similar defensive adaptations can be observed in later medieval fortifications across Europe and the Middle East. However, the presence of such features in earlier phases at Afrasiab raises the possibility that these principles were understood and applied much earlier than commonly assumed. By the early 13th century, Afrasiab was largely abandoned following the Mongol invasions, yet archaeological evidence suggests that some systems may have already been failing. Sections of the water network show signs of blockage or disrepair. If the city depended on finely calibrated infrastructure, even minor disruptions could have triggered cascading failures. A breakdown in water supply would affect agriculture, sanitation, and population stability within a short time frame. This introduces a paradox. The same level of technical sophistication that allowed Afrasiab to thrive may also have made it vulnerable. Highly optimized systems often lack redundancy. When they fail, they do so rapidly and completely. If the Afrasiab murals required knowledge that rivals controlled material science, how much ancient technology have we already lost without ever realizing it existed? At first glance, this skeleton should not be controversial. A child, buried in sediment for over 1.6 million years, discovered in a remote region near Lake Turkana in Kenya. And yet, once reconstructed, measured, and compared against everything we think we know about human evolution, it becomes clear that this is not just another fossil. It is a contradiction, one that forces a re-evaluation of how and when the human body became modern. The discovery took place in 1984, when Kenyan fossil hunter Kamoya Kimo uncovered a remarkably complete skeleton belonging to a young individual of Homo erectus. Catalogued as KNMWT 15000, the specimen would later be known as Turkana Boy. What makes it extraordinary is not simply its age, but its preservation. Roughly 90% of the skeleton was recovered, an almost unheard of level of completeness in paleoanthropology, where most finds consist of isolated fragments. For comparison, the famous Lucy, discovered in 1974, is only about 40% complete. This alone makes Turkana Boy one of the most important reference specimens ever found. But completeness is only the beginning of the problem. When scientists reconstructed the skeleton, they found a body plan that looks strikingly familiar. Long legs, relatively short arms, a narrow pelvis, and a body adapted for efficient bipedal locomotion. These proportions closely resemble those of modern humans rather than earlier hominins such as Australopithecus, which retained longer arms and shorter legs suited for climbing. Based on growth models, Turkana Boy is estimated to have stood about 1.6 meters tall at death, with a projected adult height approaching 1.8 meters. That places him well within the range of modern human populations, despite living over 1 million years earlier. This raises an immediate question. Why does a body that looks so modern appear so early in the evolutionary timeline? According to conventional models, human evolution proceeds gradually, with anatomical features changing incrementally over time. Yet Turkana Boy seems to leap ahead in terms of body structure. His limb proportions suggest an adaptation for endurance running, something associated with persistence hunting, a strategy that requires advanced thermoregulation and long-distance mobility. These are not primitive traits. They imply a level of physiological optimization that appears, at first glance, out of sequence. The contradiction deepens when we examine the brain. Turkana Boy's cranial capacity is estimated at approximately 880 cubic centimeters. This is significantly larger than that of earlier hominins, but still far below the modern human average of around 1,350 cubic centimeters. In other words, the body looks modern, but the brain does not. This creates a mismatch that challenges a widely held assumption that increases in brain size drive other aspects of human evolution. If that were true, we would expect the brain to lead, not lag behind. Instead, Turkana Boy suggests a different possibility. The human body may have reached a near-modern form before the brain caught up. If so, then the sequence of evolutionary development is not as linear as once believed. Rather than a smooth progression, it may involve overlapping phases, where different systems evolve at different rates. Even more puzzling is the question of growth and development. Determining the age of Turkana Boy at death has proven surprisingly complex. Dental analysis suggests an age of around 8 years, based on comparisons with modern human children. However, some researchers argue that Homo erectus may have matured more rapidly, more like modern chimpanzees. If that is the case, Turkana Boy could have been closer to adolescence, or even near maturity at the time of death. This discrepancy is not trivial. It affects estimates of growth rate, lifespan, and social structure. If Homo erectus developed quickly, it would imply shorter childhoods and potentially less time for learning complex behaviors. On the other hand, a slower, more human-like growth pattern would suggest extended development and the possibility of more sophisticated social systems. At present, the evidence does not decisively support either model. The result is a gap in our understanding of how early humans lived and learned. The skeleton also preserves clues about health and mortality, but these too are inconclusive. There are subtle abnormalities in the spine, including signs consistent with a possible infection or developmental disorder. Some researchers have proposed that Turkana Boy suffered from a condition such as scoliosis or a systemic illness that may have contributed to his death. However, no definitive cause has been established. There are no clear signs of trauma, predation, or catastrophic injury. The exact circumstances of his death remain unknown. Another layer of uncertainty involves respiration and vocalization. The structure of the rib cage and vertebral canal suggests differences in breathing control compared to modern humans. Some studies indicate that Homo erectus may have had less precise neural control over the diaphragm, potentially limiting the ability to produce complex, sustained vocalizations. This has implications for the evolution of language. If Turkana species lacked fine respiratory control, then fully developed speech may not yet have been possible. Yet other aspects of their anatomy and behavior hint at increasing cognitive sophistication. Once again, the evidence points in different directions. Perhaps the most overlooked issue is statistical. Turkana is in many ways a sample size of 1. Despite being the most complete Homo erectus skeleton ever found, it represents a single individual. In any scientific context, drawing broad conclusions from a single specimen is risky. There is always the possibility that Turkana was atypical, either unusually tall, unusually well preserved, or even affected by conditions that altered his development. And yet, due to the lack of comparable finds, this one skeleton carries enormous weight in shaping our understanding of an entire species. This creates a paradox. The more complete and detailed the specimen, the more influence it has. But the more influence it has, the more dangerous it becomes if it is not representative. When placed within the broader fossil record, Turkana highlights a series of gaps. Between Homo erectus and later species such as Homo sapiens, there are discontinuities in technology, behavior, and cognition. Stone tools become more sophisticated, social structures more complex, symbolic behavior more apparent, but the transitions are not always gradual or clearly documented. Instead, they appear in bursts, separated by periods of relative stability. This pattern has led some researchers to question whether human evolution is best understood as a continuous process at all. Rather than a straight line, it may be a mosaic, composed of traits that emerge, stabilize, and sometimes disappear before reappearing in new forms. Turkana fits into this mosaic, but not neatly. He represents a combination of features that do not fully align with any single stage. If Turkana represents a stage of evolution that doesn't fully match our models, then what kind of missing evidence or missing species do you think could fill that gap? In the harsh, semi-arid highlands of the Ores Mountains in modern-day Algeria, far from major rivers and deep within a landscape defined by heat, dust, and scarcity, lies the remains of Lambaesis, once the headquarters of the powerful Legio III of Augusta under the authority of the Roman Empire. At first glance, it appears to be just another Roman military camp, but the deeper archaeologists look, the more one question dominates the site. How did a highly complex, permanently occupied military city, complete with water systems, hospitals, administrative centers, and training academies function for decades in an environment that should not have been able to sustain it at all? Unlike legendary sites lost to myth, Lambaesis was never entirely forgotten, its ruins remaining visible and scattered across the Algerian plateau until systematic study began in the 19th century during French colonial expeditions. Early surveys revealed inscriptions carved into stone blocks, official Latin texts referencing military drills, discipline, and speeches delivered to soldiers, and these unusually detailed records, far more structured than those found at many other Roman sites, immediately suggested that Lambaesis was more than a simple frontier outpost. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered a carefully organized layout, including a central principia aligned with near-geometric precision, extensive barracks capable of housing thousands of soldiers, a valetudinarium indicating long-term medical infrastructure, and large open courtyards likely used for training and assembly, all pointing toward a permanent and highly disciplined occupation. Later excavations throughout the 20th century expanded this picture even further, revealing road networks extending outward from the camp and connecting it to nearby settlements such as Timgad, suggesting that Lambasis functioned not in isolation but as part of a broader regional system. Yet with each new layer uncovered, the same contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore. The infrastructure was too advanced, too permanent, and too dependent on resources for the harsh environment in which it existed. The greatest unresolved mystery of Lambasis lies beneath its stones in water, because the site preserves evidence of a sophisticated hydraulic system that includes aqueducts channeling water from distant sources potentially spanning tens of kilometers, large underground cisterns coated with waterproof materials such as opus signinum, and an internal distribution network that delivered water across the camp with remarkable efficiency. In a region where annual rainfall is low and evaporation rates are extremely high, sustaining a population of several thousand soldiers would have required an immense and continuous water supply. And when placed into measurable context, the scale becomes even more striking. A Roman legion of approximately 5,000 men, the standard size of units like the Legio III Augusta, would require at least 20 to 30 liters of water per person per day for drinking, cooking, and sanitation, resulting in a daily demand exceeding 100,000 liters, not including water for animals, industrial processes, or inevitable losses through evaporation and leakage. Yet despite this enormous demand, there is no major perennial river located nearby, making the existence of such a system deeply puzzling. Comparisons with other Roman sites only intensify the mystery, because at Vindolanda in Britain, water supply relied on abundant rainfall and nearby streams, while at Carnuntum, proximity to the Danube ensured stable and predictable access. But Lambasis operated in a marginal environment where such reliability should not have been possible. Several hypotheses attempt to explain this contradiction, including the idea that Roman engineers possessed a far more detailed understanding of regional hydrology than currently documented, allowing them to exploit hidden or seasonal water sources, while others suggest that underground aquifers, perhaps now depleted, once provided more abundant reserves than we see today. And a more controversial theory proposes that the hydraulic system may have been partially inherited or constructed upon earlier undocumented infrastructure. However, even if water could be sourced, maintaining such a system across long distances would require continuous technical oversight to prevent leakage, manage sediment buildup, and ensure consistent flow, meaning that Lambasis was not merely using water, but actively controlling it in a way that appears disproportionate to both its environmental constraints and the technological assumptions we typically assign to the period. The architectural and epigraphic evidence suggests that Lambasis functioned as far more than a conventional military base, because inscriptions found on site describe formal speeches delivered by commanding officers that outline discipline, tactical expectations, and organizational hierarchy in a manner resembling institutional doctrine rather than routine operational orders, indicating a level of administrative complexity rarely preserved in other frontier camps. The presence of large assembly halls and carefully structured training spaces further supports the idea that Lambasis operated as both a training academy and an administrative center, not simply as a place where troops were stationed. While its geographic position near the frontier zones between Roman-controlled territory and desert regions, inhabited by indigenous groups, places it at a strategic but isolated node within the empire's defensive network, this combination of features raises a compelling possibility that Lambasis may have served as a central command hub coordinating military operations across North Africa, functioning in a role similar to a regional headquarters where strategy, logistics, and communication were organized on a large scale. If this interpretation is correct, then the scale and complexity of the site begin to make sense. Yet it introduces an even deeper question. Why would such a critical command center be established in a location defined by extreme logistical challenges rather than in a more resource-rich and accessible environment? Among the most intriguing discoveries at Lambasis are its inscriptions, which differ significantly from typical Roman dedicatory or commemorative texts because many of them are highly procedural, detailing military routines, disciplinary systems, and even elements of rhetorical instruction intended for officers and soldiers alike, suggesting a standardized approach to communication and training. However, certain irregularities within these inscriptions have drawn the attention of researchers, including repeated phrasing patterns that deviate from classical Latin syntax, unusual abbreviations that are not widely attested in other regions of the empire, and structural formatting that appears systematic yet remains only partially understood. While some historians interpret these anomalies as local linguistic adaptations or shorthand used within a specific military context, others propose a more speculative interpretation in which these inscriptions may represent early forms of coded or semi-coded communication systems designed to standardize complex information across different units, allowing for more efficient transmission of doctrine and orders. Although there is no definitive evidence that these texts constitute true encryption, the possibility suggests that Lambasis may have been a site where Roman military organization reached an advanced level of abstraction and systemization that is rarely visible in the archaeological record, hinting at a layer of operational sophistication that remains difficult to fully reconstruct. By the 3rd century CE, Lambasis began to decline, yet unlike many ancient sites, its transformation does not appear to have been triggered by a single catastrophic event, as there is no clear evidence of widespread destruction, no extensive burn layers, and no definitive signs of sudden abandonment caused by invasion or natural disaster. Instead, the site seems to have undergone a gradual reduction in importance, eventually losing its central role as the Legio III Augusta was disbanded and later reorganized during periods of instability within the Roman Empire, suggesting a slow administrative shift rather than a violent collapse. Even so, this explanation does not fully resolve the mystery, because if Lambasis depended heavily on its complex water system, any disruption, whether technical, environmental, or political, could have had cascading effects on its ability to function. Yet no single cause has been definitively identified, leaving the site's decline as ambiguous as its rise. When each component of Lambasis is examined individually, it can be explained within the known capabilities of Roman engineering and military organization, including advanced construction techniques, efficient logistical planning, and strategic territorial control. Yet when all these elements are considered together, the site presents a paradox in which a large, permanent, and resource-intensive military complex not only existed, but operated successfully within an environment that should have imposed severe limitations on its sustainability. Compared to other Roman sites, Lambasis does not necessarily exceed the technical limits of the empire, but it applies those capabilities in a context where they seem least viable, making it stand out as a case where known technology was pushed into conditions that challenge our assumptions about its practical application. Do you think Lambasis was simply the result of Roman engineering at its peak, or could it be evidence of knowledge we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Peikend, also known as Peikend, did not reveal itself through monumental ruins or dramatic artifacts, but through a slow and almost accidental process of recognition during archaeological surveys in the late 19th and early 20th centuries near Bukhara. What initially appeared to be nothing more than scattered mounds at the edge of the Kizilkum Desert gradually unfolded into the remains of a structured urban center. Active from approximately the 4th century BCE to the 11th century CE, once integrated into the vast trade network of the Silk Road. Yet the importance of Pikend is not defined by its role in commerce or its chronological depth, but by the embedded technical logic of its construction, subtle, systematic, and unexpectedly advanced for a settlement in such an unforgiving environment. At first glance, Pikend appears to follow a conventional Central Asian model with a fortified citadel, surrounding residential quarters, and multiple defensive walls. But the deeper one examines its structure, the more deliberate its organization becomes. The internal street network is not random or organically formed. Instead, many pathways align along consistent axes, forming a controlled circulation system that suggests planning rather than gradual evolution. Defensive layers are arranged with redundancy in mind, where the failure of one boundary does not expose the entire settlement, indicating strategic foresight rather than reactive construction. When compared to other Silk Road cities such as Merv or Samarkand, whose layouts often reflect centuries of incremental expansion, Pikend gives the impression of being conceived with an underlying blueprint, as if its planners operated with a level of spatial abstraction that is rarely preserved in early desert settlements. This raises a deeper question about the measurement systems, surveying methods, and planning principles that enabled such consistency in a landscape where environmental constraints should have limited precision. If Pikend's urban design suggests intention, its water system suggests something far more complex: precision under extreme constraint. Situated on the margins of the Kizilkum Desert, where annual rainfall can drop below 100 millimeters and permanent surface water is virtually absent, the very existence of a stable population, likely numbering in the thousands at its peak, implies the presence of a highly reliable and carefully managed water infrastructure. Archaeological findings point to a distributed network of wells, reservoirs, and channels, arranged not randomly, but according to a coherent system that indicates coordinated planning. Some researchers propose that Pikend may have utilized a technology analogous to the Qanat systems known from ancient Persia, where underground tunnels, extending for tens of kilometers, transported groundwater across long distances while minimizing evaporation, maintaining gradients so precise that the elevation drop could be less than 1 meter per kilometer. To construct such a system without modern instruments would require a level of surveying accuracy and environmental understanding that borders on the extraordinary, involving not only the identification of underground aquifers, but also the ability to regulate flow rates with precision, ensuring that water neither eroded the channels through excessive velocity nor stagnated due to insufficient gradient. The balance is mathematically delicate, and sustaining it over long distances demands both technical skill and continuous maintenance. Even today, locating stable groundwater in arid regions requires geological expertise, yet Pikend's builders appear to have achieved this through methods that remain largely undocumented. What deepens the mystery is that only fragments of this potential system have been uncovered, with large portions still buried beneath desert sediment, leaving open the possibility that the visible remains represent only a fraction of a much larger hydraulic network. For comparison, the Qanat systems of Iran, some over 2,000 years old and still functional, are typically associated with large, organized societies capable of mobilizing extensive labor forces and maintaining complex infrastructure over generations. Yet Pikend does not clearly fit this model of centralized power. Instead, it appears as a regional hub, operating at the edge of major trade routes, raising the question of how such a settlement could develop and sustain a water management system comparable in sophistication to some of the most advanced hydraulic technologies of the ancient world. This suggests either that Pike End represents a localized peak of technical adaptation driven by environmental necessity, or that our current understanding captures only a partial view of a more extensive and coordinated system of knowledge that has yet to be fully revealed. Despite being constructed primarily from mud brick, a material typically associated with temporary or fragile structures, Pike End has preserved significant portions of its architecture for over 1,000 years, suggesting that its builders possessed a refined understanding of material composition and environmental interaction. The bricks themselves appear to have been produced using optimized mixtures of clay, sand, and organic fibers, enhancing both tensile strength and resistance to cracking, while certain walls exhibit layered construction techniques that distribute stress and mitigate erosion. In comparison to sites such as Çatalhöyük, where mud brick construction was common but subject to different climatic conditions, Pike End's desert environment introduces extreme temperature variations, persistent wind erosion, and minimal moisture, all of which would typically accelerate degradation. Yet the structures endure, creating a paradox in which a seemingly simple material is engineered for longevity in one of the most hostile settings possible. By the 11th century, Pike End had been largely abandoned, not through a sudden catastrophic event, but through a gradual process of decline that left little direct evidence of a singular cause. There are no extensive burn layers, no definitive signs of large-scale invasion, and no clear markers of epidemic collapse, suggesting that the city did not fall violently, but instead faded as its underlying systems began to fail. One plausible explanation lies in the shifting dynamics of Silk Road trade routes, which may have reduced the city's economic relevance, while another points to environmental changes, particularly the depletion or redirection of water sources that would have destabilized the delicate balance sustaining the settlement. If Pike End's survival depended on a finely tuned hydraulic system, even minor disruptions such as sediment blockage, structural collapse, or declining groundwater levels could have triggered a cascading failure, leading to the eventual abandonment of the city. Unlike river-based civilizations that can endure gradual environmental shifts, a desert city dependent on engineered water systems exists in a state of constant vulnerability, where the loss of technical functionality rapidly translates into the loss of habitability. What do you think Pike End truly represents, a natural evolution of ancient engineering pushed to its limits, or evidence of a level of technical understanding that history has only partially preserved? Hundreds of stone chambers stand exposed under the open sky, scattered across a rocky hill in southern India. No inscriptions explain them, no surviving city surrounds them, and yet each structure follows a logic, repeated, deliberate, and disturbingly consistent. The site is known today as the Higher Bengal Dolmens, a megalithic complex dated to roughly 1200 to 500 BCE. At first glance, they appear primitive, but the closer they are studied, the harder they are to explain. The site entered academic awareness in the 19th century during the expansion of archaeological surveys under British colonial administration in India. Early observers noted the unusual density of dolmens, stone-built burial chambers, spread across the granite hills of what is now Karnataka. Unlike isolated megaliths found elsewhere, here Bengal presented something different, a concentrated field of structures extending over several hectares. Systematic documentation began in the early 20th century, but it was not until later archaeological work that the scale became clearer. Surveys identified more than 400 dolmens in the immediate area, with estimates rising significantly when including surrounding clusters. Radiocarbon dating and typological comparisons linked the site to the South Indian Iron Age, placing it within a broader megalithic tradition that stretched across the Deccan Plateau. Yet from the beginning, a contradiction was apparent. Sites of this scale typically correlate with large organized settlements. Here, the expected urban counterpart was missing. Subsequent excavations revealed that many of the dolmens functioned as burial chambers. Inside, archaeologists discovered human skeletal remains, pottery fragments, iron tools, and occasionally beads made from semi-precious stones. These findings confirmed that the site was part of a funerary tradition, likely tied to ritual practices surrounding death and ancestry. However, the material record introduced new questions rather than resolving old ones. The iron objects suggested a community with metallurgical knowledge, yet no large-scale production sites were found nearby. The pottery styles showed consistency, implying cultural continuity, but offered little insight into the organization required to construct hundreds of stone structures. More striking was the spatial arrangement. The dolmens were not randomly placed. Many were positioned along ridges or elevated terrain, suggesting intentional placement rather than convenience. Some appeared grouped, forming loose clusters that hinted at social or familial divisions. But without written records, these patterns remain speculative. The most immediate puzzle lies in the imbalance between the scale of the burial complex and the absence of a corresponding settlement. If hundreds of individuals were buried here over generations, where did they live? In other parts of the world, large burial complexes, such as those associated with Bronze Age Europe, are typically linked to nearby habitation sites. At Stonehenge, for example, archaeological evidence points to surrounding settlements and seasonal occupation zones. Even when the living spaces were temporary, traces remained: post holes, hearths, refuse deposits. At Higher Bengal, such evidence is limited or ambiguous. One explanation is preservation bias. Structures built from wood or organic materials may have decayed beyond recognition. Another possibility is that the site functioned as a regional ritual center, drawing communities from a wider area rather than serving a single settlement. If so, the dolmens may represent not a village cemetery, but a shared sacred landscape. Yet this interpretation raises further questions. Organizing repeated construction at this scale would require coordination across groups, shared beliefs, and long-term continuity. In the absence of centralized authority or written systems, how was such coordination achieved? Each dolmen follows a deceptively simple design: vertical stone slabs forming a chamber, capped by a large horizontal stone. There is no mortar, no intricate carving, no visible mechanical complexity. But this simplicity is misleading. The stones used in these structures are not small. Individual slabs can weigh several tons. Transporting them across uneven terrain would have required coordinated labor, even with basic tools. Placing the armed capstone, often balanced with surprising stability, would have demanded precise control over weight distribution and alignment. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate similar constructions using only technologies available to Iron Age societies: wooden rollers, earthen ramps, and manual labor. While such methods are theoretically sufficient, they require careful planning and a large workforce. Even minor errors in positioning could result in collapse or instability. What makes Higher Bengal particularly intriguing is the consistency of execution. Across hundreds of structures, the same basic architectural logic is repeated with minimal variation. This suggests not improvisation, but a shared construction knowledge, possibly transmitted across generations. In some cases, dolmens are positioned on sloped or uneven ground. Achieving stability in such conditions implies an understanding of balance and load distribution that goes beyond trial and error. There are no written manuals, no diagrams, no surviving tools that fully explain how this knowledge was formalized. Compared to monumental sites like Stonehenge, which display complex astronomical alignments and shaped stones, the dolmens of Higher Benkel appear technically modest. Yet the challenge here is different. Instead of a few highly engineered structures, we see hundreds of repeatable units, each requiring reliable, scalable methods. In modern engineering terms, this resembles a system optimized for replication rather than uniqueness. The unresolved question is not whether these structures could be built, but how such consistency was maintained without documented standards. One of the most distinctive features of many Higher Benkel dolmens is the presence of circular openings carved into one of the vertical slabs. These portholes are often too small to allow human entry, yet too deliberate to be accidental. From a purely functional perspective, such openings are unnecessary for burial. Bodies could be placed before sealing the chamber. The effort required to carve a circular hole into a large stone slab using tools of limited hardness suggests that the feature held significance. Several hypotheses have been proposed. The openings may have served as symbolic gateways, allowing interaction between the living and the dead. They may have been used for ritual offerings, enabling the placement of food or objects inside sealed chambers. Another possibility is that they functioned as ventilation or drainage points, though their placement does not always support this interpretation. What complicates the picture is their standardization. Many portholes share similar acar and positioning, implying a shared template or cultural rule. Achieving such regularity without advanced drilling tools raises questions about the techniques employed. Repetitive pecking, abrasion with harder stones, and controlled fracturing are all possible methods, but each would require time, skill, and consistency. In archaeological terms, the portholes represent an investment of labor beyond immediate necessity. They're a deliberate addition to the structure, one that encodes meaning we do not yet understand. Beyond individual structures, the broader layout of the site suggests intentional organization. Many dolmens are aligned along natural contours of the landscape, particularly ridgelines. Elevated placement may have had symbolic significance, associating the dead with visibility, prominence, or proximity to the sky. Attempts have been made to identify astronomical alignments, as seen in sites like Stonehenge or Machu Picchu, where solar and lunar cycles are embedded into architecture. At Higher Benkel, evidence for such alignments remains inconclusive. Some orientations appear non-random, but no consistent pattern has been universally accepted. What is clear is that the builders were making choices. The placement of each dolmen was not purely opportunistic. It reflected a set of criteria, geographical, cultural, or symbolic, that guided construction over time. If a society left behind a system this organized, this consistent, and this technically demanding, why did they leave behind no trace of how it was done? What do you think really happened here? Share your theory in the comments below. Rising in Bosnia with a shape that appears too deliberate to ignore, its slopes descend at near uniform angles, its silhouette resembles a softened pyramid, and in certain exposures, its surface reveals flat, stacked stone layers that look disturbingly artificial. This is not a monument recognized by archaeology, not a protected site, not even a widely studied anomaly. And yet, Begica Glavica presents a problem that sits uncomfortably between geology and design, because the question is no longer whether nature can produce geometric forms. It can. The real question is, how precise does a natural structure have to be before it stops looking accidental? At what point does coincidence begin to resemble intention so closely that the distinction itself becomes unstable? Unlike most ancient sites, Begica glavica was not discovered in a dramatic archaeological moment. It was always there, mapped, walked upon, ignored. Its presence too ordinary to demand explanation. Its elevation roughly 100 to 150 meters above surrounding terrain never attracted scientific urgency. Only in recent decades, with the spread of aerial photography, satellite mapping, and digital elevation modeling, did its geometry begin to stand out with unusual clarity. Observers started to notice that the hill's slope seemed consistently angled, with inclinations estimated between 30 and 40 degrees across multiple faces. These values are not random. They fall within the same stability range used in human-built pyramidal structures, where gravity, load distribution, and erosion resistance are carefully balanced. This does not prove anything, but it introduces a statistical discomfort. Natural hills formed through erosion and sediment deposition typically exhibit irregular slope variation, shaped by wind direction, water flow, vegetation patterns, and tectonic disturbance. Yet Begica glavica appears unusually restrained, as if governed by constraints that are not immediately visible. This recognition echoes earlier debates surrounding the Bosnian Pyramid of the Sun, where similar claims of geometric intentionality triggered both global fascination and strong scientific skepticism. In that case, most geologists concluded that the structure was a natural hill shaped by geological processes, while critics argued that certain features remained insufficiently explained. Begica glavica, however, has not undergone the same level of scrutiny. It exists in a quieter space, largely unexamined, which paradoxically makes it more intriguing. Without the noise of controversy, its anomalies stand on their own, unfiltered and unresolved. Preliminary surface surveys conducted in the area did not reveal artifacts, tools, or any cultural layers typically associated with human activity. There were no ceramics, no burial remains, no inscriptions, no signs of habitation. By standard archaeological logic, this absence is decisive. Large-scale human construction does not occur in isolation. It leaves behind a network of evidence: quarries, transport routes, worker settlements, ritual spaces. The complete lack of such indicators strongly favors a natural explanation. And yet, despite this absence, the geometry refuses to disappear. Digital terrain analysis suggests partial alignment with cardinal directions, though not with the extreme precision seen in known engineered structures. Deviations of several degrees exist, which are enough to argue against deliberate alignment, but small enough to complicate the idea of randomness. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an error of less than 0.1 degree, representing a level of precision that remains extraordinary even by modern standards. Begica glavica does not reach this level, but it also does not behave like a typical eroded hill. It exists in a narrow band between order and chaos, where neither explanation fully dominates. As erosion and limited exploratory digging exposed deeper sections of the hill, a more tangible anomaly emerged. Beneath the surface, layers of flat stone slabs appeared, stacked in sequences that closely resemble construction courses. Individual slabs vary in size, but many fall within thickness ranges of approximately 5 to 15 centimeters, and several exhibit fracture patterns that create near-rectangular shapes. At first glance, the resemblance to masonry is difficult to ignore. The visual language of these formations, flat planes, repeating layers, consistent spacing, aligns with what is typically associated with human-built structures. However, geology offers a powerful counterargument. Sedimentary rock formations, especially limestone and sandstone, naturally develop in layered sequences as particles settle over long periods, sometimes spanning millions of years. Through lithification, these layers compress into solid rock, and under stress, they fracture along bedding planes, producing flat, stackable slabs. In certain environments, these processes can create formations that appear remarkably uniform, even engineered. Similar patterns can be observed in natural cliffs, canyon walls, and stepped terraces formed through chemical precipitation or erosion. The anomaly at Begica Glavica lies not in the existence of layers, but in their presentation. In some exposed sections, the layers are not purely horizontal but appear slightly angled, following a consistent directional gradient that mirrors the external slope of the hill. In engineered structures, such alignment would suggest intentional design for load distribution, ensuring structural stability under weight. In geological terms, this could be explained by tectonic tilting or post-depositional deformation. However, such tilting is rarely uniform across multiple exposed sections without accompanying signs of distortion, fragmentation, or irregular stress patterns. Here, the layers appear both tilted and orderly, a combination that is difficult to categorize definitively. This leads directly into the core mystery, the most controversial and scientifically unresolved aspect of Begica Glavica. Whether these layered stones are purely geological formations or the remnants of an unknown construction process. The geological explanation remains robust and grounded in established science. Stratification, lithification, and natural fracturing can collectively produce structures that mimic artificial forms, especially under stable environmental conditions. In this model, Begica Glavica is not unique. It is simply an example of how natural processes can create patterns that humans instinctively interpret as designed. Comparable formations exist in layered sandstone regions, basalt column structures, and limestone terraces, where repetition and geometry emerge without any human involvement. Yet, the architectural hypothesis persists, not because it is proven, but because certain observations resist easy dismissal. Some slabs display edge-like boundaries that appear sharper than typical erosion patterns would suggest. In localized areas, the stacking seems too orderly, with minimal variation in spacing and alignment. In certain sections, the orientation of the layers appears to follow the macrogeometry of the hill itself, as if the internal structure is reinforcing the external form. These details have led to comparisons with sites such as Puma Punku, where stone blocks exhibit machining-like precision, and Göbekli Tepe, where large-scale construction predates expected technological capabilities by thousands of years. The comparison is not direct, but conceptual. In each case, the observed outcome seems disproportionate to the assumed process behind it. At present, neither explanation fully resolves the evidence. If Begica Glavica is entirely natural, then it represents an extreme example of geological order emerging from chaotic processes, raising questions about how often such formations occur and why they are so rarely documented. If it is artificial, then it challenges fundamental assumptions about human history, particularly regarding the presence of advanced construction knowledge in contexts where no supporting evidence exists. This duality places the site in a rare scientific category, one that is explainable in theory but not completely accounted for in practice. The ambiguity becomes more significant when viewed in a broader global context. Sites such as Yonaguni Monument present underwater formations with right angles, flat plains, and step-like features that remain debated between natural and artificial origins. Similarly, Gunung Padang has been interpreted both as a natural volcanic hill and as a deeply layered structure, potentially modified by human activity. In each of these cases, the pattern repeats. Geometry suggests intention, geology provides plausible mechanisms, and the available evidence remains insufficient to close the debate. Begica Glavica fits into this pattern almost perfectly. With one crucial difference: it has not been studied extensively. There has been no comprehensive excavation, no deep core drilling to analyze subsurface structure, no high-resolution geophysical imaging to map internal composition. The absence of data naturally reinforces conservative interpretations, but it also leaves open questions that have never been properly tested. The strongest argument against any artificial interpretation remains the absence of cultural context. There are no settlement traces, no tools, no organic remains, no evidence of sustained human activity in the immediate area. Historically, large construction projects are inseparable from the societies that built them. They require labor, resources, organization, and purpose, all of which leave behind measurable traces. Begica Glavica stands alone, without this supporting framework, making the hypothesis of human construction extremely difficult to defend within current archaeological standards. Few places make the past feel deliberately hidden rather than distant. Kudakalu Parambu is one of them. At first glance, it looks almost absurd. Dozens of massive stone structures shaped like umbrellas or mushrooms, each consisting of a single vertical shaft topped by a wide circular capstone. No walls, no chambers, no obvious engineering complexity. And yet, the longer you look, the less sense it makes. Because each of these stones weighs tons, each has remained standing for over 2,000 years. And no written record explains who built them, how they were constructed, or why such a strange design was chosen in the first place. The name itself is deceptively simple. Kudakalu translates to umbrella stones, a term that describes their appearance but reveals nothing about their purpose. The site, located in the Thrissur district of Kerala in southern India, belongs to the broader tradition of Iron Age South India, a cultural horizon stretching across peninsular India between roughly 1000 BCE and 300 CE. Across this region, archaeologists have documented dolmens, stone circles, cairns, and burial chambers. But Kudakalu Parambu does not fit comfortably into any of these categories. It is familiar enough to be recognized as part of a megalithic tradition, yet distinct enough to resist easy classification. The site first entered formal archaeological awareness during surveys conducted in the 20th century, when researchers began systematically cataloguing megalithic monuments across Kerala. What they found at Kudakalu Parambu was not a single structure, but a field of them. More than 60 stone monuments scattered across the landscape. Early interpretations were cautious. The assumption, based on parallels with other megalithic sites in India, was that these were burial markers. Excavations soon provided partial confirmation. Beneath several of the umbrella stones, archaeologists uncovered burial pits containing fragments of pottery, iron objects, and, in some cases, human remains. These findings aligned with known Iron Age funerary practices in the region, where the dead were often interred with grave goods. But the more excavations were conducted, the more the narrative began to fracture. Not every structure corresponded to a burial. Some revealed no human remains at all. Others showed signs of disturbance, reuse, or incomplete construction. The pattern was inconsistent. If these were graves, they didn't follow a standardized system. If they were markers, they were applied unevenly. And if they served a ritual function, that function left behind no clear material signature. Each excavation answered one question while introducing several more. The most unsettling discoveries were not the artifacts themselves, but the absences. No inscriptions, no symbolic carvings, no directional alignments that could be definitively linked to astronomical events. Unlike sites such as Stonehenge, where alignments with solstices and celestial cycles provide at least a partial framework for interpretation, Kudakalu Parambu offers no such clarity. It is a site that appears intentional in every aspect, yet refuses to communicate its intention. And then there is the construction. At a superficial level, the design is almost primitive. A single pillar-like shaft supporting a flat disc-shaped stone above it. No joints, no interlocking systems, no visible reinforcements. But this simplicity is misleading, because when examined through the lens of physics and material constraints, the structure becomes far more complex than it appears. The stones used are primarily laterite, a material abundant in Kerala. When freshly quarried, laterite is relatively soft and can be cut with basic tools. However, once exposed to air, it undergoes a process of hardening, becoming significantly more durable over time. This characteristic may explain how the stones were shaped, but it does not explain how they were transported or erected. A typical capstone can weigh several tons. Moving such a mass without wheeled transport, draft animals capable of heavy hauling, or metal lifting tools presents a non-trivial engineering challenge. More importantly, the stability of the structure raises deeper questions. The contact area between the vertical shaft and the capstone is limited. There are no visible locking mechanisms, and yet many of these stones have remained upright for over 2 millennia, enduring monsoon rains, soil erosion, and seismic activity. This suggests an implicit understanding of load distribution and center of gravity. The builders may not have formalized these principles mathematically, but their practical application is undeniable. To put this into perspective, consider megalithic constructions elsewhere. At Stonehenge, large horizontal lintels are supported by multiple vertical stones, distributing weight across a broader base. In Korean dolmens, massive capstones rest on several supporting stones, creating a stable platform. Even in Egyptian architecture, weight is managed through redundancy and distribution of forces. Kudakalu Parambu, by contrast, relies on a single point of support. It is a minimal solution to a maximal problem. This raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the builders possessed a level of empirical engineering knowledge that we tend to underestimate, not because it was advanced in a modern sense, but because it was precise in a way that leaves little margin for error. A misalignment of even a few degrees could destabilize the entire structure. And yet, across dozens of monuments, the success rate is remarkably high. The question then becomes not just how these structures were built, but why they were built this way. If the goal was purely functional, to mark a burial site, simpler methods were available. Earthen mounds, stone circles, or basic cairns would have required far less effort. The choice to construct these umbrella stones implies a motivation beyond mere necessity. It suggests symbolism, identity, or perhaps a form of communication that has not survived in any decipherable form. Some researchers have proposed that the structures may have served as status markers, with larger or more elaborate stones indicating higher social standing. This hypothesis is supported by the presence of grave goods in certain excavated pits. However, the lack of consistent correlation between structure size and burial richness complicates this interpretation. Others have speculated about ritual or ceremonial functions, possibly related to ancestor worship. But without direct evidence, such theories remain speculative. There is also the question of spatial organization. While the stones appear scattered, closer analysis reveals subtle patterns in their distribution. Clusters form, distances repeat, and orientations show slight but measurable variation. Whether these patterns are intentional or coincidental is still debated. If intentional, they may encode information, social, ritual, or even cosmological, that we have yet to decode. What makes Kudakalu Parambu particularly valuable is not that it provides answers, but that it exposes the limits of our current understanding. It challenges the assumption that technological sophistication must be visible, complex, or aligned with modern expectations. Here, the technology is hidden in plain sight, embedded in proportions, balance, and material choice rather than in overt mechanisms. It also highlights a recurring pattern in ancient engineering: the disappearance of knowledge. The people who built these structures left no written manuals, no inscriptions, no direct lineage of transmission. Whatever methods they used were either not recorded or not preserved. This is not unique. The composition of Roman concrete, the exact formulation of Greek fire, the drilling techniques evident in certain Egyptian stone cores, all represent cases where practical knowledge was lost despite its effectiveness. Kudakaluparambu may belong to this same category, a silent demonstration of competence without continuity. If these were just graves, why build them this precisely? What do you think they were really for? Share your thoughts below. Ancient timelines are built on assumptions, layers of evidence arranged into a sequence that feels logical. Humans settle, agriculture develops, societies organize, and only then do complex structures emerge. Bonkuklu Tala disrupts that sequence. Located in southeastern Turkey, near Mardin province, this archaeological site dates back to approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, placing it firmly within the pre-pottery Neolithic period. What makes it significant is not just its age, but what exists at that age: organized architecture, communal planning, and indications of systems that should not yet exist according to conventional models. Excavations that began in the early 21st century revealed a settlement composed of circular stone structures, carefully arranged rather than randomly distributed. These are not temporary shelters. The walls are constructed from shaped stones fitted together with consistency, forming stable enclosures that have endured for millennia. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the site places its primary occupation around the 10th millennium BCE, aligning it chronologically with sites such as Göbekli Tepe. However, while Göbekli Tepe is widely interpreted as a ritual center with monumental pillars, Bonkuklu Tala presents a more complex hybrid. It appears to combine habitation with structured communal spaces, suggesting a level of social organization that remains difficult to define. One of the most striking discoveries at Bonkuklu Tala is the presence of a drainage system constructed from stone channels. These channels are not random gaps between rocks. They are deliberately arranged pathways designed to control the flow of water. In later civilizations, such as those of Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley drainage systems, are associated with urban planning, population density, and administrative control. Yet Bonkuklu Tala predates these civilizations by several thousand years. The existence of such infrastructure raises a direct question: what conditions required this level of environmental management so early in human history? Seasonal rainfall alone does not fully explain the effort invested in constructing these channels. Their presence implies foresight, repeated observation, and a shared understanding of cause and effect across the community. The spatial organization of the site reinforces this pattern. Structures are positioned in ways that suggest intentional planning rather than organic growth. Certain buildings appear to serve functions beyond simple shelter. Their internal layouts differ, and their placement within the settlement indicates a possible communal or ritual role. This duality, practical living spaces alongside specialized structures, mirrors patterns seen in later, more complex societies. Yet here it appears at a time when humanity is assumed to have been transitioning only recently from nomadic lifestyles. However, the most difficult aspect to reconcile is not the presence of architecture or infrastructure. It is the precision, embedded within the tools and the craftsmanship itself. The inhabitants of Bonkuklutala operated without metal. Their technological toolkit consisted primarily of stone implements, flaked tools, ground stone axes, and rudimentary cutting instruments. Under such conditions, variability is expected. Edges should be uneven, cuts should deviate. Structures should reflect approximation rather than consistency. Instead, what archaeologists observe is a degree of regularity that exceeds what is strictly necessary for survival. Stone blocks used in wall construction exhibit repeated shaping patterns. While not perfectly uniform by modern standards, they fall within a narrow range of size and proportion. This suggests not only skill, but a shared method, an implicit standard. When multiple individuals produce similar results without written instructions or measuring devices, it implies the existence of transmitted knowledge that is both stable and replicable. Experimental archaeology provides a useful comparison. When modern researchers attempt to replicate Neolithic stone shaping using only period-appropriate tools, results often show significant variation unless extensive training is involved. Even then, maintaining consistent dimensions across multiple pieces requires time, coordination, and feedback mechanisms. This leads to a deeper question. Why aim for consistency beyond what is functionally required? A wall can stand with irregular stones. A shelter can exist without symmetry. Yet at Bonkuklutala, there is evidence of repeated geometric tendencies curvature maintained across circular structures, alignment between adjacent features, and the integration of drainage channels that follow predictable paths. These are not random outcomes. They are decisions. In engineering terms, precision is costly. It requires additional labor, time, and cognitive effort. In early human societies, where energy expenditure is closely tied to survival, unnecessary precision would be expected to be minimized. The fact that it is not minimized here suggests that precision served a purpose beyond immediate practicality. One possibility is structural stability. More regular stones fit together more effectively, distributing load and reducing points of weakness. Over long periods, such structures are more likely to endure, which may partially explain why Bonkuklutala remains intact today. However, structural necessity alone does not fully account for the observed patterns. The level of repeatability hints at something closer to a conceptual framework, an understanding of form that is applied consistently across the settlement. Comparisons with other Neolithic sites strengthen this anomaly. At Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe, carved pillars and symbolic motifs suggest ritual complexity, but they do not necessarily demonstrate the same integration of everyday construction with infrastructural planning. Bonkuklutala appears to bridge that gap. It is not purely symbolic, nor purely functional. It operates at an intersection where utility and intention overlap. Measurements taken from excavated sections indicate that wall thicknesses remain relatively consistent within individual structures, often varying by only a few centimeters. For a society without standardized measuring tools, this level of control is non-trivial. It implies either the use of informal measurement systems, body-based units, visual estimation refined through practice, or a form of apprenticeship where techniques are passed down with high fidelity. In both cases, the outcome is the same: a community capable of producing predictable results. The implications extend beyond craftsmanship. Precision at this scale suggests communication. Individuals must agree, implicitly or explicitly, on what constitutes a correct shape or size. This agreement forms the basis of coordination, and coordination is the foundation of organized society. Yet the archaeological record at Bonkuklutala does not show clear evidence of hierarchy. There are no monumental palaces, no obvious elite residences, no inscriptions indicating authority. The system appears to function without visible central control, raising the possibility of a decentralized model of organization that nonetheless achieves complex outcomes. This contradiction, high precision without clear hierarchy, remains unresolved. In later civilizations, complexity is typically accompanied by stratification. Here, the relationship is less clear. It suggests that the development of technical skill and the emergence of social hierarchy may not be as tightly linked as previously assumed. If a society without metal, writing, or formal hierarchy could still achieve this level of precision and organization, what exactly are we missing in our understanding of early human capability? Was Bonkuklu Tala the beginning of complex civilization, or evidence that something more advanced had already been lost? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Jarkoton did not emerge from the ground as a dramatic, singular discovery. It began with fragments, scattered pottery, faint outlines of walls, and subtle anomalies in the soil recorded during Soviet-era surveys in southern Uzbekistan in the 1970s. At first, it seemed like just another minor Bronze Age settlement, but as excavation expanded, the scale shifted dramatically. What lay beneath was not a village, but a structured urban center covering dozens of hectares, dated roughly between 1500 and 1300 BCE, associated with the Sapali culture. And from that moment, the site began to contradict expectations. Conventional models of Bronze Age development suggest that complex urban systems emerged in a limited number of core regions, primarily Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley Civilization, and the Nile Valley. Central Asia, by contrast, has often been framed as a transitional zone dominated by pastoral or semi-nomadic groups. Jarkoton challenges that assumption. Excavations reveal defensive walls, organized residential sectors, and a central complex that appears to serve ritual or administrative functions. The layout suggests planning rather than organic growth. To put this into perspective, cities like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, dated to around 2600 BCE, exhibit grid-based planning and drainage systems. Jarkoton, though later by nearly 1,000 years, appears in a region where such planning was not expected at all. This raises a critical question. Was urbanization in Central Asia independently developed, or was it influenced by distant civilizations through networks we still cannot fully trace? Perhaps the most unsettling contradiction at Jarkoton lies not in what was built, but in how it has survived. The city was constructed primarily from mud brick, an unbaked mixture of clay, water, and organic material. By all conventional engineering standards, mud brick is among the least durable building materials. In environments with temperature fluctuation, wind erosion, and seasonal moisture, such structures degrade rapidly, often within decades or centuries at most without continuous maintenance. And yet, at Jarkoton, large portions of walls, foundations, and architectural outlines remain identifiable after more than 3,000 years. This is not entirely unique, but the degree of preservation is unusual. For comparison, mud brick architecture in Mesopotamia often survives only as low mounds, heavily eroded and difficult to reconstruct without extensive interpretation. Even in relatively stable desert environments like parts of Egypt, mud brick structures typically require protective conditions, burial under sand, minimal rainfall, or deliberate conservation to remain intact over millennia. Jarkoton presents a more complex case. The site has been exposed, subject to environmental stress, yet still retains structural clarity. This leads to several unresolved possibilities. One hypothesis suggests advanced preparation techniques, specific ratios of clay to organic binders, controlled drying methods, or even unknown additives that increase durability. However, Chemical analyses so far have not identified any dramatically unusual composition. Another possibility is environmental, that ancient climatic conditions in the region were significantly different, perhaps drier or more stable, reducing long-term erosion. Paleoclimate studies do indicate shifts in Central Asian climate over the past several thousand years, but not at a scale that fully explains the preservation seen here. A third, more subtle explanation is architectural intelligence design choices that minimized exposure, such as wall thickness, orientation relative to prevailing winds, or structural layering that slowed degradation. In other words, the material itself may be simple, but the way it was used could reflect a level of environmental adaptation that we are only beginning to understand. Still, none of these explanations fully resolves the contradiction. Mud brick should not last this long, under these conditions, with this level of clarity. And yet, at Jarkoton, it does. Among the most debated features of Jarkoton is its ritual complex, where archaeologists have identified structures interpreted as fire altars. These installations bear a conceptual resemblance to later practices associated with Zoroastrianism, in which fire plays a central symbolic role. The problem is chronological. Zoroastrianism, as a formalized religious system, is generally dated to the early 1st millennium BCE, although its origins may extend earlier. Jarkoton predates this by several centuries. If the interpretation is correct, it suggests that elements of fire-centered ritual practice existed long before they were codified into a structured religion. Alternatively, the resemblance may be superficial, similar forms arising independently in different cultural contexts. Without written records, the function of these structures remains speculative, but their presence indicates that Jarkoton was not merely a settlement. It was a place where symbolic or ritual behavior was spatially organized and architecturally embedded. Artifacts recovered from Jarkoton complicate its isolation. Pottery styles, beads, and certain material forms show parallels with regions far beyond Central Asia, including the Indus Valley Civilization and areas connected to Mesopotamia. This suggests participation in broader exchange networks, possibly linked to what archaeologists describe as the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, a system of interconnected settlements spanning parts of modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan. However, unlike Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, where written records and well-defined trade routes provide context, Jarkoton exists in relative silence. There are no inscriptions, no administrative tablets, no direct evidence of organized long-distance trade infrastructure. The implication is paradoxical. Material evidence points to connectivity, but the mechanisms of that connectivity remain invisible. Equally puzzling is how Jarkoton ended. Archaeological layers do not show signs of violent destruction, no widespread burning, no mass casualties, no abrupt collapse. Instead, the evidence suggests gradual abandonment. This pattern aligns with broader regional transitions during the Late Bronze Age, when climatic shifts, changes in water availability, or evolving trade dynamics may have altered settlement viability. Yet in Jarkoton, the data is incomplete. There is no single event, no clear tipping point, only a slow fading from occupation into silence. Jarkoton is not the largest or most advanced city, but it does not align with any established historical model. It introduces urban planning in a region where it was not expected, preserves mud brick architecture beyond normal limits, suggests ritual systems earlier than recorded history, and shows signs of trade without leaving clear traces. Then it disappears without a specific cause. Jarkoton does not break history, it exposes its gaps. What do you think Jarkoton really represents, an isolated anomaly, or evidence of a forgotten system of early civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Small ceramic object, no larger than a human hand, sits behind glass in a museum. At first glance, it appears simple, an animal-shaped vessel, something decorative, perhaps symbolic. But the longer it is observed, the less it behaves like a casual artifact. Its proportions are controlled, its surface is structured, and its markings follow patterns that resist randomness. It is not the scale that is unusual, it is the precision. In a time before writing, before standardized measurement, before industrial tools, this object appears as if it was designed with intent that exceeds what its era should comfortably allow. This is the so-called Vuchedol dove, created between roughly 3000 and 2500 BCE by the Vuchedol culture. It is often described as a bird, but that description may be the first mistake. The artifact was uncovered near Vuchedol, a settlement overlooking the Danube River. Archaeological evidence places this culture firmly within the Copper Age, a transitional period when metallurgy began to reshape human societies. Excavations in the region have revealed advanced copper smelting, ceramic production, and signs of social hierarchy. Radiocarbon dating of associated layers consistently places the culture between approximately 3000 and 2500 BCE, aligning it with other early complex societies in Europe. Yet unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Vuchedol culture left behind no confirmed writing system. There are no tablets, no inscriptions that can be read, no surviving linguistic framework. And yet, paradoxically, objects like the Vuchedol dove suggest structured thinking, repetition, symbolism, and encoded design. This creates a contradiction, a society capable of consistent symbolic expression, but without a decipherable language. The object is traditionally labeled as a dove, but its morphology raises immediate doubts. The neck is thick, the head elongated, and the body disproportionately heavy. It lacks the anatomical balance of a real dove and instead resembles a hybrid between abstraction and observation. Some researchers have proposed that it may represent a bird of prey. Others suggest it is entirely symbolic, not intended to replicate any real species. The ambiguity matters. In archaeology, identification often begins with resemblance, but when resemblance fails, interpretation becomes unstable. If it is not a bird, then the entire framework used to understand it collapses. What remains is a form that is clearly intentional, yet not clearly representational. This is not uncommon in prehistoric art. Similar ambiguities appear in figurines from the Vinca culture, where human-like shapes merge with geometric abstraction. But the Vuchedol dove is different. It is not just stylized, it is structured. The surface of the object is covered with incised lines, arranged in repeating geometric patterns. These are not random scratches. Microscopic analysis of ceramic surfaces from the Vuchedol site shows consistent engraving depth and spacing, indicating controlled tool use. The lines form bands, grids, and segmented areas, suggesting a system rather than ornamentation. Comparative studies have noted similarities between these patterns and early symbolic systems found across Southeast Europe. Some archaeologists have cautiously proposed that these markings could represent a form of proto-writing, a transitional stage between pure decoration and formal language. However, no direct translation exists, and no parallel text has been found to confirm this. The statistical repetition of certain motifs suggests intentional encoding. In modern terms, repetition reduces entropy, it implies information. But without a key, the information remains inaccessible. The object includes an opening, suggesting it functioned as a container. Residue analysis on similar Vuchedol ceramics has identified traces of organic materials, possibly fermented liquids. This has led to the hypothesis that the vessel was used in ritual contexts, perhaps for pouring libations. However, the form complicates this interpretation. The vessel is not ergonomically efficient. Its shape makes it unstable, difficult to clean, and impractical for repeated use. This indicates that function was not the primary constraint in its design. Instead, the object appears to prioritize symbolic form over practical utility. This aligns with ritual artifacts in many early societies, where objects are designed not for efficiency, but for meaning. But meaning requires a system, and the system here remains unknown. This is where the anomaly becomes most difficult to ignore. The Vuchedol dove was created using basic materials: clay, water, and fire. No evidence suggests the use of molds in its production. Instead, it was hand-shaped and then refined before firing. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate similar objects using period-accurate tools. The results consistently show that achieving such symmetry and consistency is possible, but only with a high degree of skill, repetition, and planning. Measurements of the artifact reveal proportional balance across its structure. The curvature of the body is controlled, the alignment of the engraved bands is consistent, and the thickness of the ceramic walls remains within a narrow range. These are not random outcomes. They indicate premeditated design. In modern manufacturing, precision is achieved through measurement systems and repeatable processes. In the Copper Age, such systems are not well documented. There are no rulers, no standardized units, no written instructions, and yet the artifact behaves as if such systems existed in some form. This paradox is not unique to Vuchedol. Similar patterns appear in other ancient contexts. The stonework of early Neolithic sites shows alignment accuracy that suggests geometric planning. Ceramic traditions across Europe demonstrate consistency in form that implies shared standards. But in each case, the tools and documentation do not fully explain the results. One possible explanation is cognitive rather than technological. Skilled artisans may have internalized measurement through practice, using body-based units or visual calibration. Over time, this could produce consistency without formal standardization. However, this does not fully account for the complexity of the engraved patterns, which require not just repetition, but spatial planning. Another possibility is that we are underestimating the sophistication of these societies. The absence of preserved tools or written records does not necessarily indicate their absence in reality. Organic materials decay. Knowledge can be transmitted orally. Systems can exist without leaving durable traces. What remains is the artifact itself, a physical object that encodes decisions. Every line, every curve, every proportion reflects a choice. And the cumulative effect of those choices is a level of precision that appears disproportionate to the assumed capabilities of its creators. The Vuchedol culture was not isolated. Trade networks connected it to broader European regions, and metallurgical evidence suggests knowledge exchange. Yet despite this connectivity, its symbolic system did not evolve into a recognizable writing tradition, or at least none that survived. This creates a deeper question. If symbolic systems existed, why did they not persist? Why do we see fragments, patterns, motifs, structured designs, but no continuous record? One explanation is disruption. Environmental change, migration, or cultural replacement could have erased continuity. Another is that the system was never intended as writing in the modern sense. It may have functioned within a specific ritual or social context, meaningful only to those within the culture. In that case, The Vuchdol dove is not a message waiting to be decoded. It is a message that has already lost its audience. Modern interpretation relies on analogy. We compare unfamiliar objects to known categories: bird, vessel, decoration. But this approach assumes that ancient creators operated within frameworks similar to ours. What if they did not? If the form is not a bird, the pattern's not decoration, and the function not practical, then the object exists outside our categories. It becomes something else entirely, an artifact of a conceptual system that no longer exists. This is the central problem. Not that the Vuchdol dove is mysterious, but that our methods of understanding may be insufficient. If ancient artifacts like the Vuchdol dove can be completely misinterpreted, how many other mysteries in history do you think we're still getting wrong, without realizing it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Old Dongola stands as a contradiction carved into the edge of the Nile. For centuries, it functioned as the political and religious center of the Nubian kingdom of Makuria, one of the most resilient Christian states in medieval Africa. Its position was strategic, its structures durable, and its influence documented in both Arabic and Byzantine sources. Yet unlike cities that ended in fire, conquest, or disaster, Old Dongola did not collapse in a single moment. It faded. The problem is not that it disappeared. The problem is that the evidence does not clearly explain why. Located along a vital stretch of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, Old Dongola controlled a corridor linking sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt and the Mediterranean world. Historical accounts from Arab geographers describe Makuria as a powerful and stable kingdom between the 7th and 13th centuries. Written records suggest long-term diplomatic relations with Islamic Egypt, including the Bakht Treaty, which maintained relative peace for centuries. From a geopolitical perspective, this location should have guaranteed continuity. River access meant water, agriculture, and trade. Natural desert barriers offered defense. Unlike marginal settlements, Dongola had every structural advantage required for survival. And yet, by the late medieval period, its prominence had diminished without a clearly identifiable rupture. Modern excavations, particularly those led by Polish archaeological missions since the 20th century, have revealed a city built in phases rather than destroyed and rebuilt. Churches were not razed but repurposed. One of the most significant findings is the transformation of a large cathedral complex into a mosque, likely around the 14th century. This transition lacks the expected archaeological signatures of conflict. There are no widespread burn layers, no mass destruction horizons, and no abrupt abandonment strata. Instead, the record shows continuity with modification. Walls were reused, foundations were preserved, urban space adapted, rather than collapsed. In comparison, sites like Pompeii present a clear destruction layer dated to 79 CE, while Angkor exhibits hydraulic system failures tied to environmental stress. Old Dongola shows neither pattern in a definitive form. The most technically puzzling aspect of Old Dongola lies in its construction. The majority of its buildings were made from mud brick, sun-dried bricks composed primarily of Nile silt, clay, water, and organic temper such as straw. By conventional engineering standards, this material is considered vulnerable. It is susceptible to erosion from wind, dissolution from water, and structural weakening under temperature fluctuations. Yet in Dongola, mud brick structures have endured for centuries in an environment defined by extremes. Daytime temperatures in the region regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius, while seasonal winds transport abrasive sand capable of gradually eroding exposed surfaces. Under such conditions, untreated mud brick architecture typically degrades within decades unless continuously maintained. Scientific analysis of surviving walls suggests several factors contributing to their durability. First, the composition of Nile silt includes fine particles that, when compacted and dried, create a dense matrix with relatively low permeability. This reduces water infiltration, one of the primary causes of structural decay. Second, the addition of organic fibers such as straw increases tensile strength and limits cracking during drying cycles. Third, wall thickness plays a critical role. In Dongola, many structures exceed 1 meter in thickness, providing thermal mass that stabilizes internal temperatures and reduces stress from expansion and contraction. However, these explanations do not fully resolve the anomaly. Comparable mud brick sites across North Africa and the Middle East, such as rural settlements in Upper Egypt, show significantly higher rates of erosion and collapse when abandoned. Even in relatively dry environments, wind-driven abrasion gradually reduces wall height and structural integrity. In Dongola, preservation appears uneven but notably resilient in key areas, suggesting that construction techniques may have included additional, less understood optimizations. Some researchers propose the use of surface treatments or plasters that reduced exposure to direct erosion. Others point to urban layout, where clustered buildings shielded each other from prevailing winds. There is also the possibility that microtopography, slight Ittifar differences in terrain, redirected water flow during rare but intense rainfall events, minimizing damage. When compared to stone-built cities like Petra, where durability is expected due to the hardness of the material, Dongola presents a different type of engineering logic. It achieves longevity not through material strength alone, but through system-level adaptation, material composition, structural geometry, and environmental interaction working together. The unresolved question is whether this resilience was the result of deliberate optimization or accumulated empirical knowledge refined over generations. There is no surviving technical manual, no written explanation of construction standards. The outcome, however, indicates a level of environmental understanding that exceeds what is typically attributed to mud brick architecture of the period. Old Dongola was once a major center of Christian Nubia, with richly decorated churches featuring wall paintings that demonstrate connections to Byzantine artistic traditions. Over time, these spaces were altered to accommodate Islamic practices. The architectural evidence suggests adaptation rather than eradication. This gradual transition challenges assumptions about religious change in medieval contexts, where conversion is often associated with conflict or forced replacement. In Dongola, the process appears more complex. It implies either a slow demographic shift, sustained coexistence, or political restructuring that did not prioritize symbolic destruction. By the 15th century, Old Dongola had lost its status as a major political center. Archaeological evidence indicates reduced occupation intensity rather than sudden abandonment. Population decline appears incremental. Several hypotheses attempt to explain this pattern. Climate change may have altered Nile flood cycles, affecting agriculture. Trade routes could have shifted, reducing economic relevance. Internal political fragmentation may have weakened centralized authority. Yet none of these factors alone provides a complete explanation. Unlike Angkor, where sediment cores and hydraulic studies demonstrate systemic environmental stress, Dongola lacks a single dominant variable. Its decline is diffuse, distributed across multiple possible causes without a definitive primary driver. The broader significance of Old Dongola lies in its resistance to simple classification. It does not align with the standard models of urban collapse, catastrophic destruction, environmental failure, or abrupt conquest. Instead, it represents a different pattern, continuity followed by gradual dissolution. This pattern raises a larger issue in archaeological interpretation. If a major city can decline without leaving a clear causal signature, how many other sites might be misinterpreted due to the absence of dramatic evidence? The lack of a clear endpoint is itself a form of data, one that challenges assumptions about how civilizations end. If a powerful capital like Old Dongola could slowly fade without war, disaster, or a clear cause, then what does that say about how civilizations truly disappear, and how many others might have vanished the same way without leaving an answer? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Built at the foot of an ancient volcanic hill, rising as a fully planned capital in the late 15th century, and beneath it, an invisible system of water engineering so precise that it still challenges modern understanding. At the base of Pavagad Hill in western India lies the Champana-Pavagad Archaeological Park, a site recognized by UNESCO as one of the most complete pre-Mughal Islamic cities ever preserved. Yet completeness is not what makes Champana mysterious, because what makes it unsettling is this. It was engineered like a system and then abandoned like a prototype that was never meant to last. Unlike many ancient sites buried deep beneath the earth, Champana was never truly lost, as local communities had always known of its ruins scattered across forests and farmland. But systematic archaeological attention only intensified during the 20th century, when surveys began revealing something unexpected. Not a random accumulation of ruins, but an intact urban system, where excavations and architectural mapping showed a fortified hilltop complex rising over 800 meters. A lower city with planned streets and districts, religious, military, and residential structures aligned along geometric axes, and most critically, a vast hydraulic infrastructure integrated into every level of the city, while carbon dating, stylistic analysis, and inscriptions link the majority of construction to the reign of Mahmud Begada, who ruled from 1458 to 1511 and sought to establish Champaner as his new capital. Yet what archaeologists uncovered went beyond political ambition, revealing a level of engineering precision that seemed disproportionate to the historical record itself. The most profound mystery of Champaner lies underground, where at first glance the site appears to contain typical South Asian stepwells, deep stone-lined shafts with descending staircases used to access groundwater. But deeper analysis reveals something far more complex. Because Champaner's water system was not a collection of isolated wells, but a coordinated hydraulic network spanning the entire city, engineered across a vertical landscape from the summit of Pavagad Hill down to the plains below, where instead of relying on a single source, engineers designed a cascading system in which rainwater was captured at higher elevations, channeled through stone-lined conduits, stored in intermediate reservoirs, and then redistributed to lower zones, creating a gravitational system that required no mechanical pumps, yet maintained consistent water availability across different elevations, a challenge even modern infrastructure must carefully model. And when compared to Roman aqueducts that operated with gradients as low as 0.15% over long distances, Champana required similar precision but in a far more complex vertical terrain, raising a critical question, not of capability, but of calculation, how such gradients were measured and maintained without surviving documentation. One of the most striking elements of this system is the so-called helical valve, a spiral stepwell descending into the earth through a circular shaft approximately 5 to 7 meters in diameter, where a continuous spiral staircase wraps downward along the interior wall, with evenly spaced steps that maintain structural balance, a design that reduces erosion by distributing load, stabilizes surrounding soil, and allows access to water across fluctuating levels without steep vertical drops, reflecting a deep understanding of geometry and load distribution. Because spiral stone architecture is notoriously difficult, and even in later medieval European fortifications required advanced planning, yet here it appears centuries earlier executed with remarkable precision, without surviving manuals or engineering texts, leaving only the structure itself as evidence of knowledge that was clearly systematic but is no longer documented. Beyond structure, the system also suggests an understanding of water quality, as archaeological studies indicate that certain reservoirs were designed with sedimentation zones, where heavier particles could settle before water moved onward, implying awareness of contamination, intentional purification processes, and a multi-stage system resembling modern filtration principles, especially when contrasted with many medieval cities in Europe that struggled with polluted water sources and recurring disease outbreaks. While Champaner appears to have implemented environmental engineering strategies rarely recorded for its time, further reinforced by its adaptation to Gujarat's semi-arid climate, where seasonal monsoons create extreme fluctuations in water availability, yet the city's system buffered these variations through deep wells reaching stable groundwater, surface reservoirs capturing monsoon rainfall, and redundant storage networks distributed across elevations, aligning closely with modern hydrological principles that emphasize redundancy and distributed storage, suggesting that Champaner was not only engineered for survival but optimized for long-term environmental stability centuries before such concepts were formally defined. The city's structures reinforce the impression of advanced planning, most notably in the Jami Masjid Champaner, which stands as one of the finest examples of Indo-Islamic architecture, featuring more than 170 carved pillars, domes aligned with near-perfect symmetry, and intricate geometric motifs repeated with minimal deviation, where detailed measurements indicate that many carvings exhibit tolerances within just a few millimeters, a level of consistency that raises difficult questions because while manual carving can achieve artistic beauty, uniform precision at this scale suggests the use of standardized measurement systems, possible templating techniques, or lost methods for transferring geometric patterns efficiently, and when compared to contemporary structures in Central Asia or the Middle East, Champaner's craftsmanship proves equally sophisticated not only in aesthetic execution, but in technical accuracy. Above the city rises the fortified complex on Pavagad Hill, where transporting stone blocks to elevations exceeding 800 meters would have required coordinated labor forces, temporary infrastructure such as ramps or scaffolding, and precise planning to align structures on uneven volcanic terrain. Yet physical evidence of such large-scale transport systems remains minimal, with no extensive ramp structures preserved and no clearly identifiable quarry-to-summit pathways, a problem that echoes similar unresolved questions at sites like Machu Picchu in Peru. Though Champaner's volcanic geology introduces additional complications, including irregular rock surfaces, steep gradients, and limited stable footing, making the successful construction of aligned, durable structures at such heights even more remarkable. In 1535, the Mughal Emperor Humayun captured Champaner, and within decades the city declined. Yet what remains puzzling is not the fall itself, but the nature of its abandonment. Because there is no widespread destruction layer, no clear evidence of catastrophic collapse, and no large-scale burning across the urban landscape, suggesting that the city was not violently erased but rather gradually left behind, as if a functioning system had simply been switched off, leaving its water infrastructure intact beneath the ground, its buildings standing above it, and its engineering still present but no longer actively maintained. What do you think was Champaner an isolated achievement, or evidence of a broader engineering tradition we have yet to fully uncover? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
What kind of civilization chooses to build a city where survival itself is uncertain? Not in a fertile valley, not along a river, but on a dry, elevated ridge of volcanic rock, exposed to wind, heat, and isolation. La Camada does not fit the pattern of ancient urban planning. It breaks it. And the deeper archaeologists dig into this site, the more it resists simple explanation. The ruins of La Camada, located in the semi-arid region of Zacatecas in northern Mexico, were first documented in the 17th century by Spanish chroniclers, who described massive stone structures rising unexpectedly from a harsh landscape. However, systematic archaeological investigation did not begin until the 20th century, when researchers started mapping the site and excavating its terraces, plazas, and ceremonial structures. Early surveys revealed that La Camada was not a small settlement, but a complex urban center covering more than 100 hectares, with construction phases spanning roughly from 400 CE to 900 CE. Initial excavations uncovered a series of large artificial terraces carved into the hillside, supported by retaining walls made of carefully fitted stone blocks. These terraces were not random. They were engineered, leveled platforms, some extending over tens of meters, designed to support buildings, plazas, and pathways. The scale of labor required to construct them is difficult to overstate. Without metal tools or draft animals, workers would have had to quarry, transport, and place thousands of tons of stone across steep terrain. Compared to sites like Teotihuacan, which benefited from relatively flat geography, La Camada's construction required solving a fundamentally harder engineering problem: how to impose order on a mountainside. As excavations continued, archaeologists identified key architectural features that deepened the mystery. Among them was the so-called Hall of Columns, a large rectangular structure supported by multiple stone pillars. The function of this building remains debated. Some researchers interpret it as a political or administrative space, while others argue for a ceremonial role. Nearby, a Mesoamerican ball court was discovered, aligning La Camada culturally with broader traditions found in central and southern Mexico. Yet its presence raises a paradox. Ball courts are typically associated with dense, ritual-focused societies. Why would such a feature exist in a location so environmentally marginal? Further discoveries added layers of complexity. Defensive walls stretching hundreds of meters across the ridge suggested a concern with protection or control. The positioning of these walls, combined with the elevated vantage point of the site, indicates a strategic awareness of the surrounding landscape. From La Camada, one can observe vast stretches of territory, making it an ideal location for surveillance or signaling. This has led some scholars to propose that the site functioned as a fortified outpost, possibly controlling trade routes that connected central Mesoamerica with northern regions. However, this interpretation does not fully account for the ceremonial and symbolic architecture found within the site. The coexistence of defensive features and ritual spaces creates a tension that has yet to be resolved. If La Camada was primarily a military installation, why invest in monumental ceremonial structures? Conversely, if it was a ceremonial center, why construct such extensive fortifications? The duality suggests a more complex role, perhaps as both a political and ritual hub operating at the frontier of cultural influence. One of the most striking phases of research came with the analysis of burn layers across the site. Archaeologists identified widespread evidence of fire damage, including charred beams, ash deposits, and heat-altered stone surfaces. Radiocarbon dating places this destruction near the end of the site's occupation, around the 9th century. The uniformity of the burn patterns suggests a large-scale event rather than isolated incidents. Yet the cause remains uncertain. Was Lakamata attacked and destroyed by external forces? Or was it intentionally burned by its own inhabitants as part of a ritualized abandonment? This question connects to a broader pattern observed in Mesoamerican archaeology, where some sites appear to have been deliberately decommissioned. However, the scale of burning at La Camada is unusual. The intensity and extent of the damage imply a coordinated effort, one that would have required planning and collective action. If the inhabitants chose to destroy their own city, it raises a deeper question. What could compel a society to erase its own monumental achievements? The most persistent and perhaps most unsettling mystery of La Camada lies in the identity of its builders. Unlike major civilizations such as the Maya or the Aztec, whose histories are preserved through inscriptions and later chronicles, La Camada offers no clear textual record. Archaeologists often associate the site with the Chalchihuites culture, a regional tradition identified through ceramics and settlement patterns. However, this classification remains tentative. The material culture found at La Camada shows both local characteristics and influences from central Mexico, suggesting interaction, but not necessarily direct control. This ambiguity has significant implications. It means that La Camada represents a level of architectural and organizational complexity achieved by a society that remains largely anonymous. There is no known ruler, no deciphered script, no definitive cultural label. In contrast, at Teotihuacan, we see a vast urban grid, standardized construction, and evidence of centralized planning across an area exceeding 20 square kilometers. At La Camada, we see comparable ambition in a far less hospitable environment, but without the same clarity of social structure. The absence of clear authorship forces archaeologists to rely on indirect evidence. Artifact distributions, construction techniques, and spatial organization become the primary tools for reconstructing the past. Yet these methods can only go so far. They reveal how the site was built, but not who made the decisions, what beliefs guided them, or how they understood their own environment. This gap between physical evidence and human intention is where the mystery of La Camada becomes most profound. Another unresolved aspect concerns the site's relationship to broader regional dynamics. Some theories propose that La Camada was part of a defensive network responding to pressure from northern nomadic groups. Others suggest it was a node in long-distance trade systems, facilitating the movement of goods such as turquoise, obsidian, and shells. Chemical analyses of materials found at the site indicate connections spanning hundreds of kilometers, pointing to a level of integration that contradicts the idea of isolation. Yet these connections do not fully explain why such a massive and complex site would be established in a location with limited agricultural potential. By the 10th century, La Camada was abandoned. There is no evidence of gradual decline or transformation into a smaller settlement. Instead, the site appears to have been left behind after the destructive event, its structures exposed to the elements for centuries. Unlike other regions where populations shifted and rebuilt, La Camada did not experience significant reoccupation. Its purpose, whatever it was, seems to have ended abruptly. In evaluating La Camada, one must confront a fundamental contradiction. The site demonstrates advanced planning, large-scale labor coordination, and architectural sophistication. These are hallmarks of organized societies with clear social hierarchies and economic systems. Yet the environmental context, the ambiguous cultural identity, and the unresolved cause of its destruction all challenge conventional models of how such societies function. So, what do you think La Camada really was? A fortress? A ritual center? Or something we still don't understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Civilizations do not normally build more than 100 temples without a clear, unified design. Yet in the rugged landscape of Aihol, along the banks of the Malapraba River, a contradiction emerges that challenges both logic and historical expectation. Dating primarily between the 6th and 8th centuries CE under the Chalukya dynasty, this site contains over 120 structures, each one slightly different, each one seemingly testing a new idea. The mystery is not just what Aihol is, but what it was trying to become. Unlike other ancient centers where architectural evolution follows a gradual and traceable progression, Aihol compresses experimentation into a single geographic space. Styles that should be separated by centuries appear side by side. Forms that belong to different cultural traditions coexist without clear hierarchy. The result feels less like a finished city and more like a controlled environment, an ancient laboratory of stone. Aihol was not discovered in the traditional sense. Local communities had always known of its existence, but systematic study began during the 19th century under the Archaeological Survey of India. Early documentation revealed something unusual. These temples were not built in a linear sequence, but in overlapping phases, often modifying or reinterpreting earlier designs. One of the most important clues comes from the Maguti Jain temple inscription, dated to approximately 634 CE. This inscription anchors Aihol historically, linking it to the Chalukya king Pulakeshin II. However, archaeological analysis shows that many structures predate and postdate this inscription, suggesting continuous experimentation over multiple generations. Excavations have uncovered not only foundations and structural modifications, but also evidence of architectural adjustments mid-construction, walls shifted, columns repositioned, and layouts altered. Such changes imply that builders were not simply executing plans, they were revising them in real time. The most unsettling mystery at Aihol lies not in its diversity, but in its precision. Many of the temples were constructed using dry stone techniques, blocks fitted together without mortar. Yet the joints are so exact that even modern measuring tools struggle to detect gaps beyond fractions of a millimeter. From an engineering perspective, this level of accuracy exceeds functional necessity. A stable structure does not require such perfection. In fact, in many ancient systems, slight irregularities help distribute stress more evenly. Yet at Aihol, stones are cut and aligned with a degree of geometric control that suggests an advanced understanding of load transfer and material behavior. Consider the placement of stone beams and ceiling slabs. Some of these elements weigh several tons, yet they are supported by relatively narrow columns. Modern structural analysis indicates that the load distribution in such systems depends on precise alignment of contact surfaces. A deviation of even a few degrees could significantly increase stress concentrations. The builders of Aihol appear to have anticipated this, achieving tolerances comparable to finely machined components. When compared to Roman engineering such as the arches of the Colosseum, the contrast becomes clear. Roman builders relied on arches and concrete to redistribute forces efficiently across curved surfaces. At Aihol, however, the approach is fundamentally different. Instead of dispersing stress through curvature, the structures concentrate load through carefully controlled Nakort Teepsukdar, stone contact points, almost as if the builders were experimenting with micro-load balancing systems. There is also evidence of interlocking mechanisms in certain structures, where stones are shaped to fit into each other in ways that prevent lateral movement. This technique, while known in other ancient cultures, appears here in a more experimental and inconsistent form, as if multiple solutions were being tested simultaneously. The question that emerges is unavoidable. Why invest such effort into precision that provides no immediate practical advantage? One possibility is that Aihol served as a testing ground for structural optimization, an attempt to understand how stone behaves under different conditions. Another More controversial hypothesis suggests that the builders possessed a theoretical framework, perhaps a form of early applied geometry or proto-engineering science that has not survived in written form. Aihole is often described as the cradle of Indian temple architecture, but this label does not fully capture its complexity. The site contains early examples of multiple architectural traditions: the northern Nagara style, the southern Dravida style, and the hybrid Visara form. What is unusual is not their presence but their coexistence. In most historical contexts, these styles emerge in different regions and evolve over time. At Aihole, they appear together, sometimes within a single structure. The Durga temple, for instance, features an apsidal plan reminiscent of earlier Buddhist Chaitya halls, combined with elements that would later define Hindu temple architecture. Meanwhile, the Ladkhan temple resembles a secular assembly hall with a flat roof supported by massive stone beams, lacking the vertical emphasis typical of later temples. Such diversity suggests that Aihole was not bound by a single religious or cultural framework. Instead, it appears to have been a place where ideas were tested, combined, and reinterpreted. Many ancient structures align with celestial events, but Aihole presents a more complex pattern. While some temples are oriented toward the east, others deviate slightly, creating variations in how sunlight enters the interior spaces. These deviations are not random. Observations suggest that different temples produce distinct light patterns at different times of the year. In certain cases, sunlight illuminates specific parts of the structure only during particular seasons, hinting at a deliberate manipulation of solar angles. Compared to monuments like Stonehenge, which exhibit precise alignment with solstices, Aihole's approach appears less about exact calibration and more about exploring a range of possibilities. This raises the possibility that the site functioned as a form of experimental observatory, where builders studied the interaction between architecture and light. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Aihole is its apparent incompleteness. Many structures show signs of partial construction, finely carved bases supporting unfinished upper sections, or detailed columns beneath rough, unpolished stone surfaces. In most archaeological contexts, such features indicate interruption, war, resource shortages, or abandonment. But at Aihole, the pattern repeats across multiple sites, suggesting something else entirely. If these were prototypes rather than final products, their incomplete state may have been intentional. Each structure could represent a stage in an ongoing process, a snapshot of experimentation rather than a failed project. So what do you think Aihole really was, an ancient architectural laboratory? Or something even more advanced that we still don't understand? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Just off the northeastern coast of Crete lies Moklos, a rocky island barely large enough to sustain a small village, with no rivers, no farmland, and no strategic fortifications. And yet during the height of the Minoan civilization, roughly between 3000 and 1200 BCE, this seemingly insignificant landmass became something far more complex, a hub of production, exchange, and possibly controlled knowledge, where archaeological evidence reveals advanced metallurgy, long-distance trade, and architectural precision emerging from a place that, by every geographic and logistical metric, should have remained peripheral, creating a contradiction that defines the mystery itself. Because Moklos does not behave like a settlement, it behaves like a system. The modern understanding of Moklos began in the early 20th century, when American archaeologist Richard Seeger conducted excavations between 1904 and 1906, uncovering over 30 stone-built tombs filled with finely crafted goods, such as gold jewelry, carved seals, and imported stones. and later excavations led by Geoffrey Soules revealed dense architectural remains including workshops, storage areas, and what appears to be a harbour-facing production zone. And although population estimates based on housing density suggest only a few hundred inhabitants, the volume and sophistication of artifacts indicate an economic output far beyond local needs, establishing a fundamental mismatch between scale and capability that defines Moklos. Among the most debated discoveries at Moklos are its gold artifacts, many of which reveal under magnification the use of granulation, a technique in which microscopic spheres of gold are fused onto a surface to create intricate geometric and organic patterns. With some granules measuring less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter, and experimental archaeology has demonstrated that achieving consistent granulation at this scale requires temperature control within a narrow range of approximately 800 to 900 degrees Celsius, because temperatures too low prevent bonding while temperatures too high cause the particles to collapse into amorphous masses. Yet the granules at Moklos are not only uniform in size, but also symmetrically arranged and fused without visible solder lines, flux residues, or binding agents, indicating a level of thermal precision and process control that appears disproportionate to the technological context of the Bronze Age, raising the question of how such artisans monitored and stabilized temperature without instruments, especially when similar levels of granulation are more commonly associated with the Etruscan civilization more than 1,000 years later. And although metallurgical studies suggest the possible use of charcoal furnaces with forced airflow generated by bellows systems capable of increasing combustion efficiency and heat stability, no definitive remains of such advanced installations have been identified at Moklos itself, leaving the operational infrastructure behind this precision largely speculative, while trace element analysis further reveals deliberate alloying of gold with silver and copper in controlled ratios to manipulate hardness, melting point, and color tone, indicating not only empirical skill but predictive understanding of material behavior, suggesting that the artisans were not simply experimenting but operating within a refined technical framework. And when these factors are considered together, the evidence points toward a production system that was controlled, repeatable, and optimized, resembling a specialized metallurgical industry rather than a localized craft tradition, raising the possibility that Moklos functioned as a restricted center of high-precision manufacturing embedded within broader trade and knowledge networks that have not yet been fully reconstructed. The architectural remains at Moklos reveal walls constructed from cut stone blocks with tight-fitting joints and minimal use of mortar, where some surfaces appear smoothed and leveled beyond what is typically achievable with basic Bronze Age stone tools, suggesting controlled shaping and finishing processes. And this style resembles early forms of ashlar masonry that would later become more widespread in advanced architectural contexts, and comparisons are often drawn to sites such as Machu Picchu, where stone fitting reaches extreme precision, despite being separated by more than 2,000 years and vast geographic distance. Yet at Moklos such techniques appear in a setting lacking the political scale, monumental architecture, or ceremonial complexity typically associated with high-investment construction, which raises the question of why such precision was applied in what should have been a relatively modest settlement, suggesting either the presence of specialized builders or the transfer of architectural knowledge into a context that does not align with traditional models of technological diffusion, reinforcing the idea that Moklos operated under conditions that allowed advanced techniques to exist independently of large-scale urban or imperial frameworks. Material analysis shows that artifacts from Moklos include obsidian traced to Melos, as well as lapis lazuli likely originating from northeastern Afghanistan, one of the few known ancient sources of this mineral, along with additional evidence suggesting contact with Egypt and the Levant through stylistic parallels and compositional signatures, placing Moklos within a vast maritime network extending across thousands of kilometers. Yet despite this extensive connectivity, the island shows no evidence of large-scale storage facilities, centralized warehouses, or shipbuilding infrastructure that would normally accompany a major trading hub, suggesting instead that Moklos functioned as a high-efficiency processing node where materials were received, transformed, and redistributed rather than accumulated, operating more like a relay point within a distributed system than a conventional port city. And this interpretation aligns with the observed mismatch between artifact complexity and settlement scale, reinforcing the idea that Moklos played a specialized role within a larger economic and technological network that extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Certain architectural zones at Moklos differ from residential and industrial areas, consisting of small enclosed rooms with repetitive layouts and containing objects that appear ceremonial rather than functional, while tombs associated with the site contain items of disproportionately high value relative to the scale of the community, including finely crafted metal objects and imported materials, suggesting that Moklos may have functioned as a controlled environment in which specialized knowledge, particularly metallurgical techniques, was restricted to a select group, implying a social structure in which technical expertise was not widely distributed but concentrated and possibly protected. And this interpretation provides a potential explanation for the high level of craftsmanship observed at the site without requiring the entire population to possess such skills, indicating that Moklos may represent not a typical settlement, but a localized center of specialized production operating under conditions of controlled access and knowledge limitation. Around 1500 BCE, Moklos experienced a period of destruction likely connected to the eruption of Thera, an event that geological evidence suggests caused widespread ash fallout, atmospheric disruption, and possible tsunami activity across the Aegean region. And although some level of reoccupation occurred after this event, the intensity and complexity of activity at Moklos never returned to its earlier peak. And more significantly, certain techniques, particularly in fine metalwork, appear to decline or shift in character, indicating not only physical disruption, but also a breakdown in the transmission of technical knowledge, suggesting that whatever system had supported the high level of craftsmanship at Moklos was either dismantled or no longer sustainable after the environmental and social shocks associated with the eruption. What do you think Moklos really was, just a trading outpost, or something closer to an ancient technological hub? Share your thoughts in the comments below,